This story told about an unusual heroine who, despite her negative character, was able to survive until the very end of the book, which in itself was a rarity for fairy tales, where the villains are usually defeated and disappear long before the end. The girl blessed by fate had hair as white as freshly fallen snow and eyes of a scarlet hue, which made her a real beauty, captivating everyone who dared to look at her bright, attractive appearance. The time traveler woke up in the body of a tiny baby, still a child lying in a cozy crib. And for a long time, she could not believe that she had somehow miraculously turned into one of the characters from a book she knew. From a grown woman of 20, she suddenly turned into an 8-year-old girl from a noble aristocratic family whose background implied refinement, luxury, and a carefree existence completely different from her previous life. At first, it seemed to her like a real blessing, especially when she carefully examined her new appearance in a large mirror. The graceful features of her face, refined manners, and fresh youth of her appearance inspired admiration. The girl did not feel the need for anything. The table was full of delicious dishes. She could try any food she dreamed of, and enjoyed the fact that her life now resembled a fairy tale embodied in reality. She lived in a luxurious house where every detail from exquisite furniture to decorative ornaments emphasized the wealth and refined taste of its owners. But this external beauty did not bring her complete peace. However, quite soon, she began to feel uncomfortable, because beyond this wealth, she was surrounded by monotonous gray buildings, a dull landscape, and a cold wind that brought a feeling of loneliness and emptiness. The ending of this story was far from happy. An open book with a pen lying on its page reminded us that even the most fabulous dreams sometimes end completely differently than we would like. The main character found happiness by linking her fate with her beloved, whom she married, and spent many years in harmony and joy, enjoying every moment of their life together, full of love, warmth, and mutual understanding. At the same time, Siren, surrounded by the darkness of loneliness, sat in a high tower, clutching a dying man to her eyes full of sadness, and her heart breaking with pain for the one she perhaps loved the most. This handsome man was called Aegis Acernia, and his mortally wounded appearance made the scene especially tragic. It was unbearable for the lady to see how the life slowly left his body, leaving her with a feeling of hopelessness and loss. This man, despite growing up in a wealthy, aristocratic family and bearing the title of Duke, lived his entire life in sorrow and hardship, as if wealth and high status could not heal him from deep inner grief. There were rumors among the nobles that their family had once been blessed by the goddess of fortune herself, granting them not only wealth, but also a rare favor of fate that distinguished them from other noble families of the empire. However, soon, the old duke, known for his kind nature and bright smile that warmed those around him, passed away, leaving behind warm memories, but also a void that could not be filled. After his death, everything changed. It seemed that the goddess of fortune had turned away from their family, and a series of misfortunes, troubles and falls began to rapidly fall upon the once prosperous house, which could no longer return to its former glory. Gradually, the family's affairs began to deteriorate. Their once thriving business was on the verge of decline, and their money reserves were running out every day, leaving fewer and fewer opportunities to restore their former prosperity. A gold ring glittered on the Duchess's hand. Her fingers stretched forward, as if she were trying to convey her despair to someone, or perhaps lift the invisible curse that was weighing on their family. Despite the financial crisis, the Duke's family continued to live a lavish lifestyle without taking into account their expenses, and this disregard for reality became a fatal mistake that turned into a real disaster for them. The final tragedy was the fate of the merchant ships they had sent out to sea, but which were unable to escape a devastating typhoon. The ships sank along with all their cargo, finally undermining the last of their financial position. Following this tragedy, an article appeared in the local newspaper stating that the Duke of Acernia had also perished along with the sunken ships, his life cut short as suddenly as the good fortune that had once accompanied his family. At this turning point, the Marchioness of Melfort appeared on the scene, extending her gracious helping hand to the Duke's orphaned family, but her sly smile and look betrayed the hidden motives behind her apparent generosity. The Marchioness, possessing striking beauty and a keen mind, offered her help, but on a condition that seemed almost impossible. In exchange for support, the family had to give her the Duke's heir. Once a proud and principled aristocrat, he would never have accepted such a humiliating offer. But now, in a desperate situation, he signed the contract without hesitation, fully aware of the price he would have to pay. The girl enthusiastically read the sequel to the book, which described how the insidious Marchioness of Melfort immediately began to manipulate the mind of the heir handed over to her, gradually instilling her ideas in him, and imperceptibly turning him into a tool for the implementation of her ambitious plans. The young boy devoted almost all his time to his studies, fulfilling the strict requirements of his new mentor, who carefully shaped his character and worldview, pursuing exclusively her own goals. It was soon decided that Aegis Acernia, the heir to the ducal family, would marry a young girl from the Melfort family, which would guarantee the transfer of all the wealth of the ducal family to the new bride and her greedy family. However, the Countess's true intention was much greater. She thirsted for noble blood, which according to her plan could be given by a child born from the union of her relative and the Duke's heir, and this goal justified any of her actions. Aegis was blessed with a rare and extraordinary talent in magic that set him apart from most other mages. His abilities not only surprised, but also delighted, placing him on a pedestal among sorcerers. This young man possessed such incredible power that in the art of witchcraft, there was no one who could compare with him, and his power remained unquestioned even among the most experienced magicians. The Countess, greedy for power and authority, sought to possess what was unavailable to most, the magical power and influence that the heir could provide her with, and this is what prompted her to decide to seize him. A selfish aristocrat, full of a thirst for control, decided to steal the heir and brainwash him into becoming her obedient tool, unaware of the betrayal she had been planning from the very beginning. She literally chained him, forcing him not to think about any other options, but only to obey her will, creating a vicious circle from which there was no way out for his will and freedom. Siren used her husband, manipulating him at her discretion, and he, like a faithful dog, carried out all her orders, not daring to question or resist her power, living in a world where his desires and freedom were subordinated to her goals. The main character, Juliana, was the epitome of beauty and strength. Her golden hair, like the sun's rays, sparkled against the backdrop of her magical power, which she used with determination and skill worthy of the greatest magicians. Juliana quickly realized that Aegis had been subjected to severe brainwashing as her hand touched him, and she felt his mind becoming more and more alien to his true will. The lady lifted the veil from his eyes, revealing the truth to him, and after that, she carefully looked after the poor Duke, who, ignorant of his past, sought help in what remained of his soul. One day, Aegis disappeared, went into the dark forest, swallowed by its gloom, where no man could find him. He dissolved into its depths, as if trying to escape from everything that connected him to the past, to what had once been his life. But soon he returned, walking confidently and firmly, and appeared before the one who had destroyed his life without hesitation, like a man determined to break free from the chains that her hand had laid upon his fate. He stopped in front of her, in front of the mysterious beauty with white hair, who was looking thoughtfully out the window, as if she felt that the moment of this meeting was inevitably approaching. Siren, upon learning that her husband had finally gotten out of control, couldn't help but let out a sarcastic laugh, smirking at his weakness, and then, without a shred of regret, pulled out her blade and instantly ended his life. The boy, aware of his fate and not wanting to resist the inevitable, calmly accepted the tip of the blade extended to him by his wife's hand, and peacefully closed his eyes, ready to meet his death in her hands, as if gaining freedom. With a great sense of loss and disappointment, the girl raised her head with difficulty, her gaze directed upward as if searching for an answer to the question that her life should not become part of a repeating cycle of pain and sadness. Her gentle hand lay on the page of the book, as if trying to find comfort in the words she had read, but thoughts about her future husband, who might become her support and protection in this cruel world, did not leave her heart. The little girl stood turning towards the loud voice that called upon them to bring the guest at once, since the time of waiting had long since come to an end, and her presence had become unbearably necessary. It turned out that the boy had grabbed his girlfriend's hem tightly, and with despair and tears in his eyes, was begging her not to leave him, not to abandon him at that moment when his heart was filled with fear. With an evil smile, clearly pleased with her victory, the Countess watched what was happening, feeling complete satisfaction that she had managed to subjugate the will of the young Duke, turning him into her toy. Tears kept flowing from the boy's eyes. He felt bad and scared, pain squeezed his chest, and inside there was an emptiness that no look or word could fill, only the bitterness of loss. The noblewoman categorically ordered Siren to immediately bring to her that bad boy who dared to disobey her instructions, and now, in her opinion, he was obliged to be punished for his insolence. This influential woman was so powerful that everyone around her was afraid to even utter a word against her, knowing that she would not tolerate objections and would always get her way. With the speed worthy of a true aristocrat, the Countess got rid of other claimants to the inheritance, and without hesitation took the place of the head of the family, confidently and easily establishing her power. The youth, continuing to beg his friend with despair in his voice, asked her not to give him into the hands of this evil lady, hoping for her protection. Although in his eyes there was no longer any confidence that she could help him, the girl, with a slight regret in her voice, only said that it was high time for the guy to give up, because she understood that there was little she could do for him in this cruel world where strength often turns out to be more important than will. In a rude and mocking tone, the woman said that her daughter had too kind a heart, as if it were her weakness, and she could not understand true cruelty, which did not stop her from manipulating everyone around her. The boy continued to cry. His face remained so beautiful and sad, but no one except his friend showed pity for him, and he felt his world crumbling and the only stronghold of kindness disappearing. The Countess took a step forward. Her cold gaze and confident gait betrayed a true sadist who enjoyed the suffering of others, ready to enjoy every moment when others fell before her will. That is why the strict lady surrounded herself with people who were as cruel as she was, people who served her faithfully and without question, sharing her views on strength and submission. The little girl said plaintively that her friend was not feeling well at the moment, and suggested postponing the punishment until another time, but her words sounded like an empty formality, hiding the real cruelty that she planned to use later. The boy was subjected to cruel brainwashing, during which the first instruction implanted in his mind was that he should become a submissive and uncomplaining servant of the Countess's family, losing his will and independence. In addition, he was instilled with another attitude. He had to madly love his girlfriend, the Countess's daughter, named Siren, subordinating all his feelings and thoughts to her, completely forgetting about common sense and his true desires. All this took place in the Room of Illusions, a place specially created to manipulate other people's minds, where the Duke's son came every week, being completely subject to control and alteration of his perception. The young man, being in this nightmarish place, saw hallucinations, and no matter how much he asked for help, no one responded, leaving him alone with his own horror, which only intensified with each passing day. A hand suddenly grabbed the boy by the wrist as he desperately tried to break free, striving for freedom. But his efforts were useless, and he found himself a prisoner of those who did not want to let him go. The maids, with unwavering determination and cold eyes, held the youth, not giving him the opportunity to leave, despite all his attempts to free himself, forcing him to remain in this gloomy place. Ages, overcome with panic, raised his hand, as if trying to protect himself from those around him who were pressing on him with their presence, as if no one saw or heard him in this merciless world. As a result, the boy found himself kneeling in front of his girlfriend, looking at her with hope in his eyes, as if he was looking for salvation in her gaze, believing that she could become the light that would lead him out of this hell. However, Siren did not extend a helping hand to her friend, standing before him with an emotionless expression, coldly and dispassionately watching his suffering, showing no desire to intervene. The little girl's hand clutched the hem of her dress tightly, as if trying to stop herself from helping the boy, knowing that it could get her into trouble. And in her world, weakness was unacceptable. With a sad expression on her face, the girl, trying to hide her feelings, quietly asked him to be careful with her friend, trying not to show that in fact she was very worried about him and could not calmly watch him suffer. The lady walked away, leaving her friend in agony because he was already 14 years old, and she realized that she could not help him in any way because the brainwashing had gone too far and he was no longer who he was before. The chains that bound the boy were incredibly strong, and although he was forced to obey the order to love his girlfriend, this did not mean that he would obey the Countess's family, despite all efforts to control him. Siren stood by the window, looking thoughtfully into the distance, thinking how much easier it would be if Aegis broke down, submitted, and became a servant of their family without resistance, and accepted his fate without a fight. The little girl slowly climbed the high stairs of her house. Each step seemed heavy and inevitable, like her own situation, where every decision was limited by cruel laws and rules. Another part of her soul was deeply outraged by the fact that the boy continued to be abused. His will violated and desperately sought to free him from this cruel fate in order to give him a chance for a peaceful life. Siren, feeling a severe headache pierce her consciousness, grabbed her head with her hand, feeling her strength leaving her. Everything around her began to seem foggy, and the fatigue was so heavy that she could barely stand on her feet. When the doors closed behind her, she found herself in a familiar room that seemed to be waiting for her return. She was wearing a light dress that softly wrapped around her body, and the darkness, like an invisible wall, slowly took over the space surrounding her and absorbing everything around her. The girl, feeling how heavy and painful her body had become from the accumulated fatigue and worries, fell exhausted onto her bed, hoping that sleep would help her forget, at least for a while, about all the problems and worries that were haunting her. There was a distinct bruise on Melfort's leg, every glance at which was a reminder of the pain she had endured. Touching it brought a sharp pain, and the sensation itself was so unpleasant that she tried to avoid any contact with the injured area. The girl woke up feeling someone entering her room and noticed Aegis standing next to her, touching her leg, which made her heart beat faster in surprise and alarm. With trembling hands, he carefully took her ankle, silently apologizing for the pain he had caused her earlier when he had grabbed her leg in the hallway, begging for help and asking for forgiveness for his actions. The girl gently pressed her toes to his leg and calmly, with concern in her voice, told the Duke's son that she was fine, despite everything she had been through, trying to show that she was not offended or angry at him. However, Aegis could not hide his feelings and tears gathering in his eyes. He, full of regret, knelt down again, asking for forgiveness, not knowing how to correct his mistakes and what to say to deserve forgiveness. Siren, seeing his despair, gently stroked his head, thus making it clear that he was not guilty of what was happening, that he was only a victim of circumstances and not a villain, and she was not ashamed of his actions. Aegis, not believing his ears, slowly raised his head when the girl, with a warm and understanding look, invited him to sit next to her, thereby giving him the opportunity to feel support and comfort at this moment. The young man obediently sat down next to the beautiful girl, and a little embarrassed, he quietly asked if he could take her hand, not knowing how to properly express his desire at that moment. Their hands met their fingers, intertwined awkwardly, as if both were trying to figure out how not to ruin this moment, and their hearts beat in unison despite the shyness that had overcome them. After that, Aegis kissed the girl's palm tenderly and affectionately, feeling the warmth of her skin, and his gesture was full of sincerity and admiration, as if he was trying to convey the full depth of his feelings without a single word, leaving only a silent confession. Meanwhile, a white bird woke up above the roof of the house, soaring into the air like a symbol of new hope, while Siren promised herself that she would do everything to free her friend from the curse of his falling in love with her. A lonely feather, as if forgotten and abandoned quietly and slowly, fell down, gliding through the air, leaving behind a light trail in the silence, like a symbol of lost hope or the completion of some important moment. The lady stood with her eyes closed, her face hidden under a black veil, which seemed to represent mourning as a sign of deep, sorrowful respect. Every gesture was imbued with silent sadness. Her presence was silent and full of the bitterness of loss. 3 years passed, and Siren, having become a more mature and beautiful girl, now stood in the cemetery dressed in a dark dress, her gaze full of memories and pain, and her heart responded heavily to every thought of the past. The Duke of Achernia had passed away, and his funeral had begun. The procession moving slowly, and with every step one could feel the weight of loss hanging in the air, marking the end of one era and the beginning of a new one of complete uncertainty. People who gathered at the cemetery could not hold back their tears, remembering what a kind and sympathetic person the late aristocrat was, whose loss left a heavy mark on the hearts of all who knew him. The Countess, holding back her emotions, walked forward and approached the family of the deceased, where she offered her sincere condolences, expressing her support and respect at this difficult moment. Hoping to comfort the loved ones of the deceased, the lady portrayed compassion with impeccable skill, although inside her heart was glad at such a repetition of the situation when it was possible to show one's importance and attention despite hidden emotions. Meanwhile, the ladies were talking animatedly, exchanging words full of respect and sympathy, while the guy and his sister stood at a distance, watching what was happening, feeling how the atmosphere around them was changing. The rude, handsome man harshly called the woman a hypocrite. His words sounded defiant, not hiding his contempt, and then, without waiting for an answer, he turned to his relative and, with a cold expression on his face, asked what would happen to them now that the Duke was dead. The three people stood in a circle and began to talk about the Duke's son, who had not yet undergone complete brainwashing, but now, despite the danger, had to leave them and return to his family, which of course threatened him with great risks. Karen turned to his interlocutor and confidently said that everything would be fine, because Ages, like a faithful dog, followed their little sister, carrying out her instructions and always ready to protect her without doubting his actions. Suddenly, the girl raised her hand and pointed her finger forward, as if showing the way or hinting at some important decision that had been made, but was still unclear to the other participants in the conversation. The young man standing by his father's coffin froze in awkwardness, feeling how sadness and uncertainty overwhelmed him. Although he did not allow the tears to come out, leaving everything inside as if trying to be strong despite the pain he was experiencing, the girl and her brothers looked at the boy standing to the side, who showed no emotion. His face remained motionless, his eyes indifferent, as if he was detached from what was happening. Yet strangely, the ends of the Duke's son's hair turned white, as if it were an invisible sign or harbinger of changes that no one knew about yet, but which were already beginning to be felt, creating a feeling of inevitability and anxious uneasiness. One of the boys hurried up to the young nobleman and, carefully covering him with his cloak, told him that it was normal to cry at a funeral, that expressing his pain and bitterness at that moment was completely natural and dignified, despite his attempts to remain restrained. From the outside, it seemed that the Countess's family treated her adopted son warmly, and harmony reigned between them. Everyone behaved with restraint and kindness, as if they had long since become one close-knit family, supporting each other in any situation. After the boy brought his friend to their company, everyone breathed a sigh of relief because the disguise was almost blown, and they only narrowly escaped exposure, realizing how close they were to everything falling apart. It turned out that the eldest son of the Melfort family, whose name was Michael, had been posing as the Duke's son all this time, hiding his true identity, and he was almost exposed due to the rain, which caused an unexpected obstacle. The moment came when the Countess bade farewell to the widow, saying that it was time for her to go, as if it were an urgent matter, and her words were filled not only with sympathy, but also with importance, like a last duty to the departed Duke. The carriage moved off, and the Melfort family, immersed in silence and contemplation, headed home, each member of the family absorbed in his own thoughts and experiences, leaving behind the burden of the past day. Ages, dressed in a new white dress and breathing heavily with excitement, anxiously asked where Ages was at that moment, unable to understand where the young man could be and what was happening to him at that difficult and uncertain moment. The maid standing near the door replied that the boy had been locked in the basement, and her voice sounded determined, but at the same time with a note of concern, as if she could not explain why everything had happened the way it had. The beauty, descending the stairs with a rapidly beating heart, was afraid that the young man who had been in the room of illusions for a long time could do something terrible that would lead to irreparable consequences, and she could not allow this. The girl froze in place, seeing her childhood friend kneeling in front of her, his gaze filled with pain and hopelessness, and she couldn't help but feel her heart squeeze from the weight of this sight. The young man, noticing his beloved, reached forward, but his movements were limited because he was tied up, and his mouth tightly closed with tape did not allow him to utter a word, leaving him in a state of silent pleading. When the girl, with tears in her eyes, helped remove the gag from his mouth, Ages, barely holding back his emotions, whispered the name of his beloved, as if it was the only word that could convey all his pain and gratitude for saving him. He collapsed into her arms, completely exhausted, no longer able to kneel. His body was exhausted, and mental anguish was pressing on him, depriving him of all strength and will to resist. The girl, with desperate anxiety in her eyes, realized that the magical shackles had really weakened the guy, but she didn't know how to help him in this situation, and feeling her helplessness, she hugged her childhood friend, not wanting to let him go. The key to the shackles was always in the pocket of the Countess, who, being evil and treacherous, held this power in her hands, and this was the only way to free the young man from his painful state. Suddenly, There was a deafening crack, and the handcuffs, as if under the influence of invisible magic, cracked and broke, splitting into pieces, which left the girl in complete amazement, unable to understand how this was possible. She stared at her interlocutor in surprise, trying to understand how he could have freed himself, because despite the lack of magical powers, he somehow managed to get rid of the bonds, which seemed impossible, and made her doubt his true nature. The man hugged his beloved tightly, and at that moment, nothing could come between them. Their hearts seemed to beat in unison, and they knew that together, they could overcome any difficulties. The noblewoman quietly called out to the boy, who was holding her tightly in his arms. Not letting go, and feeling his body pressed against hers, she felt their connection becoming deeper and stronger than ever, filling her heart with inexpressible warmth and confidence. She gently touched his back with her hand, saying that it was hard for her to breathe, as if everything happening around her was swallowing her up, and the air was becoming heavy and unbearable. When Aegis was younger, after being brainwashed, he was unable to come to his senses for a long time, lying in bed, overcome by nightmares that would not let him go, leaving his soul captive to fear and pain. Siren sat next to him the whole time, never taking her eyes off her friend, holding his hand tightly and whispering soothing words, assuring him that everything would be fine, despite the severity of what was happening. Their hands were joined, and the little girl, filled with anxiety, kept a restless eye on her friend, who lay unconscious, not knowing what would happen next, and how to help him return. Finally, after much torment and emotional distress, Aegis came to his senses, and with difficulty moving away from his beloved, they silently met each other's eyes, trying to understand each other in this oppressive silence that reigned between them. Blushing to the roots of his hair, the Duke's son, with inexpressible pain in his voice, asked where his lady was, why she had left him, because he loved her so much, and now he could not understand what had caused her disappearance, leaving him in emptiness. From above, as if tired of life, a white flower fell to the ground, its petals slowly falling as a symbol of the fragility and vulnerability of all things. With each fall, it reminded us how easily what is dear to us is lost. Looking away, Siren, with a slight sadness in her eyes, decided to hide the truth and not tell her friend that she had just been to his father's funeral. Instead, she lied, saying that she had just decided to take a walk down the street, leaving everything inside. The nobleman's wrists were bandaged, and the girl, noticing this, asked with concern how his wounds were doing, not hiding the anxiety she felt for his condition and health. The guy, quickly hiding his hands, hurried to reassure her, saying that everything was fine, but sweat was running down his face, revealing his anxiety despite his attempts to hide the pain. Gently took his hand, and with a soft smile said that she would help him change the bandages that were soaked with blood, showing care and tenderness, ready to support him in any situation. From that moment on, Aegis began to treat his lady with much more respect, no longer allowing himself to cry, and not refusing brainwashing sessions, realizing the importance of it for their relationship and for himself. The guy, as if broken into pieces, stood in front of her with an empty look that spoke of his blind submission, as if he was completely losing his personality and was absorbed in everything that was happening. The girl, with slight surprise, asked him not to hurt himself anymore, but was surprised by his answer, in which he said that everything depended on how often she would pay attention to the nobleman, as if this was a condition for his condition. With a sad smile and regretful eyes, Aegis admitted that Siren had been neglecting him a lot lately, and he felt abandoned, which echoed in his words like barely suppressed pain. Once the girl changed the bandages on the handsome man's wrists, the blood no longer seeped out, and the wounds were neatly bandaged, leaving his body safe and more protected from further damage. Aegis no longer submitted to anyone but his lover, and although still affected by his past, he stopped resisting the brainwashing sessions, realizing that it was part of his path. The boy watched the insects and nature with an empty gaze, not experiencing any emotions, as if everything around him had become meaningless, and his soul was consumed by indifference. Tired of seeing her childhood friend suffer, Siren finally takes a step to help him, hoping that maybe she can reverse his condition and bring him back to life. When the lady told him that he had to return to Acernia's house for a while, Aegis did not respond with joy. There was sadness in his eyes, and he asked doubtfully if he had lost his favor in the eyes of his beloved, who in his opinion might drive him away. With a scary smile on his face, the boy said cruelly that they locked him here, brainwashed him, and now that he was no longer needed, they wanted to throw him away like unnecessary trash, leaving him alone with the pain. In the end, he admitted that he tried to take his own life, because in the last illusion, Siren turned away from him and walked away, leaving him in excruciating loneliness. He felt his soul crumbling and hope disappearing until he was left alone with emptiness. The hand that ages had clenched into a fist could not stop trembling, but the girl gently stroked his fingers, trying to comfort him, showing that she was there, ready to help and support, despite his internal torment and despair. Having calmly listened to the handsome man's request that she not leave him because she was the meaning of life for the Duke's son, Siren felt how important it was for him to maintain this connection and not let her go despite all the worries. Ages expressed his deep fear of losing his mistress, to which Siren, with restraint and confidence, reminded him that only she had the power to decide what would happen to him and to command him no matter how much he wished otherwise. Gently, but with a slight sternness, the noblewoman began to stroke her companion's cheek, feeling his nerves tense, and asked him to prove his worth if he really did not want to be thrown away like unnecessary cargo. If Ages officially becomes the head of the family, then only prosperity and wealth awaits him, provided that he does not stand still and does not give in to difficulties, because Melfort needs a strong and decisive leader. The noblewoman decided to give him 3 years to prove that he was truly worthy of her, and during this time, she was determined to find a way to free the poor Duke despite all the obstacles that would stand in the way. With a maniacal, almost frightening smile, Ages smugly whispered that he would definitely prove his worth, and then Siren would stay with him forever, without any doubts, because only he would be worthy of her. The lady obediently agreed with his words, continuing to calm him down, stroke him, and show that despite his pain and doubts, she would stay close supporting him in this difficult moment, ready to be his support. Siren sat in a luxurious room, decorated with exquisite objects, and listening attentively, realized that finally a date had been chosen for an important event. And outside the window, there was magnificent weather, where the trees swayed in a light breeze. Opposite her, sitting with an expressive and stern face, was her mother, who, without hiding her determination, announced that they had only 4 days left to thoroughly prepare for the upcoming event, and she was not interested in any excuses or delays. The woman's fingers delicately wrapped around the handle of the cup lifted it with extraordinary grace, causing the cup to swing lightly in her hands, creating a feeling of refined sophistication and elegance. Smiling slyly, the Countess confidently and decisively demanded that Siren make the man her lover, as if demanding that she fulfill some obligation that could not be rejected. In the original story, there was no love affair between Siren and Ages, and their relationship remained more of a mistress and her loyal servant, where respect and duty took precedence over personal feelings. She clutched the fabric of her dress with her fingers and thought that she couldn't do what Siren did in the novel and sleep with a guy who was already suffering from life, even though he was close to the social circle. Looking at the cup of drink, Siren thought about how she could make this guy her lover because he was soon to become a duke, and perhaps this thought made her heart beat with special hope. With a cruel laugh, the woman said that it would be useful if her daughter went to bed with the future noble aristocrat, because in that case, she could gain much more power and influence over him. Although the Duke of Acernia's family had lost much of its influence, it was still powerful, retained its strength, and was one of the few who still possessed the ancient magic passed down through generations. Siren, sitting in a chair, thought about it and asked her mother why it was her lover and not her fiancé who had to become her chosen one, because this question contained a much more complex and multifaceted meaning. In a calm voice, the woman explained that a lover could be used, and then, if necessary, simply gotten rid of, while with a husband, everything would be much more complicated because the obligations would be much more serious. The beauty could not help but draw her mother's attention to the fact that, unlike her father, this guy was completely obedient to her and also possessed qualities that could benefit her and serve her well in the future. Putting her hand to her chest, Siren firmly said that she would make the choice herself regarding what would happen to the Duke and who he would become for her, because only she had the right to decide his fate and her own. Knocking on the door before entering, Siren loudly warned her childhood friend that she was coming, trying not to disturb his peace, and to make it clear that her visit would not be a surprise. However, when she entered, she found that the room was empty, surrounded by expensive furniture, and the atmosphere itself was incredibly calm, with elements of luxury and beauty, creating a sense of coziness. Ages lay quietly on the bed, deep in sleep, showing no signs of consciousness, which seemed even stranger in the silence, as if his mind was far removed from everything that was happening around him. Gently with care, Siren carefully removed the blanket and touched the boy's wrist, wrapped in bandages, feeling how the thin bandages concealed the traces of pain and wounds experienced. Turning away, the noblewoman said with a serious expression that a decision had been made. In 4 days, the boy would be returned to his family. For the future duke, this was sad news, because he had to part with his beloved, which broke his heart. The girl raised her head, realizing that she had to tell the boy about his father's death. But before she could utter a word, a strange voice interrupted her, and she fell silent, not having time to fulfill her mission. A maid named Marina entered the room quietly, announcing that his mother was calling the duke's son to her. But despite her words, the reason for the call remained unclear, and the woman never explained what exactly she wanted to tell him. Obediently got out of bed, without asking questions, headed towards the door, taking hold of the door handle, and after taking a few steps, was ready to carry out the order, not even knowing what awaited him beyond the threshold. Siren quickly jumped out of bed and wasted no time in following him, striding across the cold floor, her mind fully focused on what was about to happen next. Together, as a couple who had decided to take this step, they went down to the torture cellar, where they were met by the evil countess, clearly surprised that her daughter had come with the duke's son, which was unusual and even dangerous. The tyrant woman removed her glove with a cold and confident movement, and then extended her hand towards the old candle that was emitting hallucinatory smoke, and her face took on an ominous confidence. The dark purple incense candle burning in the dim light looked terrifying. Its flame seemed to show real nightmares, absorbing the space around and filling the air with ominous energy. Disappointed Siren opened her eyes when she smelled the candle and immediately realized that the countess had doubled the dose, making the hallucinations much stronger, which only increased her anxiety and worry about the future. With a cruel smile, the countess ordered the servant to tie up the boy, and her words sounded with such desperate coldness that it seemed that she saw in him nothing but an instrument for her experiments. The maid obediently picked up the magical shackles from the floor, their metal gleaming in the dim light, ready to fulfill their role in this dark act that had no place in normal life. Ages, who had not yet recovered from the previous session, could hardly realize that such a dose of incense would most likely lead to serious consequences, and his mind could be completely broken, swallowed up by the abyss of hallucinations. The countess, standing in front, turned to her daughter with cold surprise, asking her how she could want to stay and watch the duke's son suffer, as if not noticing the horror that it would bring. Suddenly, the girl stood right in front of her childhood friend, with a slight mockery on her face and pretending to be cruel-eyed, saying that Ages had already become an obedient dog, completely submissive to her will, which caused a strange satisfaction. The woman, suddenly extending her hand forward with a confident gesture, offered to test how well the aristocrat obeyed his mistress. Confident that her words could convince everyone of how much he had now lost his independence. Raising her head, Siren asked the handsome man with a cold gaze if he would resist her, his beloved trying to understand how ready he was to submit to her will and follow her desires. In response, Ages silently kissed his mistress's hand, expressing not only consent, but also complete submission, demonstrating that he was ready to carry out her orders without the slightest hesitation. The girl's mother's expression was wary and suspicious. She clearly did not trust what was happening and was trying to test their relationship, watching their every move with cold hostility. Ages tore his lips away from the lady's hand when she sternly said that he was doing everything wrong, and showed another gesture symbolizing her complete dominion over him as the master of his fate and will. The future duke, without hesitation, knelt down, submitting to her will, and thus expressed his readiness to obey all her orders, despite the inner doubts and feelings that he hid from everyone. The man's head ended up at the feet of his beloved, right at the hem of her dress, symbolizing complete submission and unquestioning acceptance of his role in this hierarchy. The man kissed his mistress's shoes. Each touch of his lips, to the expensive material, seemed like an act of deep respect and recognition of her power over him, which was now beyond doubt. The room erupted in joyful applause from the cruel woman, who watched this turn of events with obvious satisfaction, pleased with how quickly and without resistance everything had worked out according to her plan. Suddenly, Michael entered the room firmly asking the woman to stop her actions and stop using incense on the already subdued Duke, as if trying to stop further playing with his mind and will, which could lead to irreparable consequences. The woman froze in shock when she heard that Acernia's carriage had already arrived to pick up her heir. She was stunned because the transport was only supposed to arrive in 4 days, and not now, which disrupted all her plans. Michael looked away awkwardly, realizing his mistake, and admitted that he seemed to have mistakenly informed the Duke's family of the wrong date, which had caused an awkward atmosphere that he could not help but regret. The tyrant mother, passing by her son, sternly said that she did not expect anything else from him because he was her son, and his role was clear: submission, and following her will without any thought or doubt. For the nobleman who was being tortured this time, in his mother's opinion, was not supposed to be a rest, but the final moment of suffering, completing his trials, and finally undermining his will. Siren looked out the window, where the white birds fluttering in the air created a sense of calm, as if nature itself was oblivious to the cruel reality that was unfolding within. It was the end of the story, where Aegis was finally freed from the effects of the brainwashing. But before him stood the cruel Siren, mocking and enjoying her control, not realizing that her power was already threatening everything. She sat there, her hands covered in blood, a symbol of the dark side she had embraced without regret, as if enjoying the results of her actions, despite the consequences for others. The noblewoman awoke from the nightmare that had haunted her, and trembling hugged herself, with her arms feeling the fear that she could become as cruel as the evil Siren from the novel, whose fate did not please her. Looking at her clean hands, she suddenly saw bloody marks on her fingers, which belonged to the real heroine into whose body she had been infused, as if becoming part of this terrible fate that she could not escape. Getting up from her chair, the aristocrat walked to the window, trying to breathe in the fresh night air, to clear her head of the disturbing thoughts that were consuming her, and to try to find at least some peace in the dark, silent night. She had been studying astronomy for a long time, completely absorbed by the magic of space. She was attracted by the science, everything that was connected with the sky, the stars, the endless galaxies, distant and beautiful worlds, full of unknown wonders. Suddenly, the door creaked, quietly began to open, and she realized that she had a guest, an unexpected night visitor, whose presence at that moment disturbed her entire pensive atmosphere, breaking the silence in which she was trying to find peace. Turning away from the window, Siren asked, with a slight but noticeable excitement, if Aegis had come to her, sensing that his appearance could bring with it something important, perhaps even fateful. And indeed, the guy was standing next to her. His face was sweaty, and his gaze was sad and absent-minded, as if he had just experienced a nightmare that had left a mark on his soul, not giving him peace. The girl, seeing his condition, waved her hand, pointing to the bed, to put it mildly, so that he would come there, and promised to help him calm down and fall asleep again, so that at least for a while he could forget his terrible visions. Obediently, the nobleman, despite his fatigue, walked towards her. His steps were quiet and smooth, and on his feet were soft slippers that made almost no sound as he crossed the room following her directions. The guy hugged his beloved, and their bodies were so close that it seemed they had become one, sharing the warmth and peace that they had been looking for so long. The beauty, feeling his strong embrace, gently asked him to loosen his grip, because the embrace had become too tight, but he only smiled in response and said that they should stay as close as possible all night. With a persistent look, full of tenderness and confidence, Aegis whispered that, all this time, he loved only one of his lady and no one else, as if his heart was forever attached to her. However, when Siren woke up the next morning, she found that her acquaintance was no longer there. It was as if he had disappeared, leaving only the memories of his words and presence, as if he had never existed. Aegis left for the Duchy of Acernia, where a large estate, stately courtyards, and palaces awaited him, testifying to his new position in the world, and also that he had left behind his old life for a new beginning. The boy, who had a noticeable bruise near his eye, approached his sister and asked if she had seen their brother, whose name was Karen, with obvious concern in his voice, as if he was looking for him in the crowd. Siren, sitting down on the velvet sofa with the name Maxion, thought absently, trying to imagine who he had managed to fight with, feeling that his difficult character and tendency to conflict could lead to problems again. The girl, without showing any emotion on her face, quietly asked what happened between the twins, And what was the reason for their quarrel? As if it did not bother her much, but she still expected an explanation, trying to understand the situation. It turned out that this morning, Karan, unable to restrain himself, threw the gauntlet at the back of the future Duke, who was already about to leave, as if the throw was not only a challenge, but also a gesture full of contempt and anger. Since today was a completely inappropriate day for such a situation, Maxian tried his best to stop his irritated and disobedient brother, realizing that his aggression could lead to serious consequences. Ultimately, the guy, despite his good intentions, received a painful black eye for his unsuccessful attempt to intervene in the conflict, which only added to the unpleasant consequences and complicated the situation. Throwing down the glove has always symbolized a challenge to a duel, a sword fight in which the participants had to prove their courage, willpower, and skill, sometimes putting at stake not only honor, but also life. Karan often challenged the boy they had adopted into the family with the hope of winning, believing that luck would be on his side this time, but he was never able to gain the upper hand despite his fury and determination in the fights. But what is even more unfortunate is that Aegis always won without striking back, as he could not harm anyone from the Melfort family, even if the situation required it maintaining his inner kindness. Trying to hide his bruise with his hand, Maxian calmly said that the reason for Karyun's anger in the morning was his dissatisfaction and irritation that had accumulated overnight, and he could hardly contain his emotions starting the day in such a mood. The reason the guy was so angry was because Aegis was leaving his sister's room after a night out, which could only mean one thing. Something had happened between them that had greatly affected his mood and future actions. Maxian let out a tired sigh and warned his sister that he would go to the garden to find their brother, hoping that at least there he would be able to talk to him and understand what was really going on, as the situation was becoming more and more alarming. On this day, Aegis looked like a completely different person. His new hairstyle, elegant clothes, and stylish appearance created the image of a handsome aristocrat, but his gaze remained empty, as before, reflecting inner emptiness and alienation. The noblewoman could not take her eyes off the new appearance of her childhood friend, who was now so irresistible that even she could not help but admit his attractiveness, despite everything that was happening around her. The nobleman bowed his head respectfully, and with a slight hint of emotion, asked Siren to extend her left hand to him for a moment, which was a gesture of respect, and at the same time, a sign of his deep respect for her person and dignity. The brothers standing behind were angry and quarreling, because the Duke's son had clearly begun to pay attention to their sister, which did not suit them at all, and they could not calmly watch such signs of interest in their own sister. The charming lady gracefully extended her gentle hand to this charming, handsome man, allowing him to carefully hold her palm, as if it were the moment when their destinies were intertwined in one enchanting instant. Aegis, in a soft but firm tone, told her not to try to take her hand away, because he was not going to let it go. Then, as if to confirm his words, he leaned down and gently gave her a kiss full of sensuality and passion. Unexpectedly, at some point, he looked at her hand from afar, and playing with her finger, lightly bit one of them, adding elements of play and unexpected provocative attention to this gesture, which caused her slight surprise. Siren, feeling the sharp pain and surprise from his unexpected action, winced, her face distorted for a moment from a combination of unexpected emotions, as if she could not immediately understand how to react to such insolence. With a mysterious smile on his lips, Aegis, looking into her eyes, explained that this bite was a kind of symbol replacing the ring, and that in this way he showed no one would dare to steal her in his absence, because she already belonged only to him. Their fingers were gently joined, and at that moment, Siren, with a slight smile on her face, suddenly said that there was no need for this, for their hearts had long since found each other and did not require additional gestures. A red carriage with golden elements, decorated with black patterns and lanterns on the sides, was already standing at the palace, waiting for its owner to return him home, where he could rest after a busy day and find peace again. Aegis, standing by the window, carefully watched his beloved, realizing that his long journey would soon begin, and this meeting would perhaps be the last for a long time, because ahead of them was their separation, which stretched into endless distances. The carriage wheels moved smoothly, and the vehicle moved forward with grace and confident movement, leaving the palace grounds, leaving behind only the sounds of receding footsteps and memories of the journey experienced. 3 years flew by in an instant, and all this time, Siren prayed tirelessly, spending hours in silence, sincerely asking the higher powers for well-being and good luck for the Duke. Because his fate was so dear to her, she sat on her knees, absorbed in her thoughts and prayers, and whispered a sincere petition for a long, prosperous journey for the one who had become closer to her than anyone else, praying for his health and prosperity. Siren became more beautiful every day, as if an inner light filled her soul, and her physical beauty only enhanced her radiant charm, and she often went to church to be closer to God. The birds, spreading their wings, suddenly flew into the sky from the small chapel, as if symbolizing the prayers that reached the heavens, taking with them all the experiences, hopes, and aspirations, bringing only a bright future. The girl standing in front of the noblewoman, with shining eyes and joy in her voice, announced that she had collected all the money donated by the lady and sent it to charity, helping those in need, making her contribution to the common good. It was Juliana, the main character of the novel, who gratefully accepted this gesture from the lady, highly appreciating her good deeds and generosity, because it was such actions that could help many people, giving them hope and support. Siren laughed merrily, and with a smile said that all the credit for this action belongs to her interlocutor, who with a big heart and kindness took part in such an important matter. The Holy Virgin, slightly embarrassed by such words, modestly replied that this was their common achievement, because they both worked in a single impulse, doing good, and helping those who needed their support and care. It was precisely because the main character stood before her that Siren decided to portray complete piety and faith in God, striving to establish a strong relationship between them and create an atmosphere of trust and mutual understanding. However, Siren was deeply worried because she had not yet decided to ask for help for the Duke, fearing that the Holy Virgin would not understand her true intentions and would be frightened, doubting her request. If the reputation of the evil Countess suffers, then of course this will also affect her brothers, because the fate of each member of the family is closely connected with the general public opinion, and each of them will bear the burden of consequences for the actions of the other. Siren extended her hand forward, and with determination and calmness, said that she had only done her duty, acting as a true believer in God, for there was no other way for her but to act in accordance with high morality and faith. The Holy Virgin was very pleased with this answer, sensing the sincerity and piety in Siren's words, and with a slight smile, suggested that after their next meeting, she would definitely go with her to the temple to offer prayers together and strengthen their faith. Siren gratefully accepted the invitation, and with a smile thanked her interlocutor, promising to look forward to their next meeting when they could share the joy of joint prayer. Juliana, before parting with her friend in faith, warmly announced that, as soon as the beauty returned, she would immediately be brought to the chambers of the Holy Virgin, and then they would go to the temple together to further strengthen their spiritual connection. Watching her friend leave, Juliana thought about how good and virtuous she was, unaware of the hidden feelings and motives of the mysterious lady who clearly had her own plans and goals. Siren, in turn, was very different from other people who were afraid to get close to the Holy Maiden, because her true goal was much more complex than just maintaining a good relationship, and she acted with cold calculation, hiding her real intentions. With determination and dignity, Siren walked past the maid, who happily welcomed the lady home, and then the noblewoman announced that she would be heading to the library to spend some time reading, immersing herself in the world of books. Thousands of books, neatly arranged on the shelves, created an atmosphere of coziness and silence, where each volume told its own story, waiting to be opened and unraveled. For Siren, it was a world of knowledge in which she felt at home. All this time, Siren tried to learn as much as she could about the palm and flower that her mother used to cause the Duke's hallucinations. She sought to understand the magic behind these objects, hoping to find answers to her questions. That Ages was able to endure so many sessions without losing his mind was a true miracle, because even the most resilient minds could succumb to the influence, but the Duke proved to be unusually strong in spirit, withstanding all the tests that fate placed upon him. While searching for the right book, the lady wondered who would have thought of using incense as a means of brainwashing, because such an approach seemed very unusual and incomprehensible, but perhaps it had its own secret advantages. After a long search, she finally managed to find the book she needed, but the text was written in a foreign language, which caused her some concern, because she was not sure of her ability to understand it. The girl began to study the book. The process turned out to be long and tedious. Reading required attention and patience, but she was sure that it would help to find a suitable remedy for the Duke's treatment, despite all the difficulties. The blue sky outside the window gradually turned pink, signaling the arrival of evening time, and the soft light of the fading day filled the air with a special silence and tranquility, creating an atmosphere of transition to night. Michael stood leaning against the wall, attracting his sister's attention. His gaze filled with some deep thought, and he seemed to be waiting for at least some kind of response from her, hoping for her understanding. The lady replied in a rude tone that she was busy at the moment, and despite his request or expectation, she did not intend to devote time to him, which caused a slight disappointment in his soul, but he did not insist. This answer deeply irritated the brother, and his look full of discontent and silent reproach was so expressive that it left no doubt that he could not forgive his sister for such treatment. And her words touched him to the quick. Slamming his hand on the table, the tall young man declared with determination that he had not come to his sister by chance, but with important news that could affect their future lives, and he was determined to convey it as quickly as possible. The girl froze in surprise when she learned that Aegis had come here not for a chance meeting, but with the intention of seeing her specifically, and this unexpected information made her heart beat faster, filled with excitement. Time slipped away like sand, and 3 years flew by unnoticed like hours, leaving behind only memories of how quickly life changes and how important it is to have time to enjoy every moment without losing sight of the main thing. By order of her mother, the Countess the Maiden often lived in the house of the Duchy of Achernia, being under the protection and care of this powerful family, which became for her a familiar shelter full of comfort and tranquility. There, Aegis always greeted her with a kind smile, and surprisingly, it was in this place that the beauty often found rest and peace than at home, which made her think and think about new sensations and changes in life. But this lasted only a year, and soon the guy began to write her long letters, filled with experiences and thoughts, which became more frequent and emotional, and his words made her think about what was happening. Siren answered briefly, as she was not verbose, preferring to express her thoughts concisely and without unnecessary phrases, which seemed to give her words special significance and sincerity, forcing everyone to listen more attentively. Leaving everything else for a moment, the beauty upset, and with sadness in her eyes, thought about how long she had not seen her childhood friend, and how much her soul yearned for those times when their communication was simple and sincere, without any complications. Aegis must have had some good reason for coming so openly and visiting the lady, but perhaps he simply missed her presence, and missed her for nothing else could explain his unexpected appearance. Siren was the only lady for whom a man continued to cross the threshold of this house, despite all the circumstances, and this spoke of something more than just respect, because she occupied a special place in his heart, which was obvious to everyone. In order to prove his worth and strengthen the influence of his family, the Duke of Achernia was determined to increase the wealth and status of his family by making important decisions that would undoubtedly strengthen his position in society. When her brother asked her if she would agree to meet Aegis, the lady gave a short and decisive refusal, ordering him to tell the guy to come another time since it was not convenient for her to accept his visit now. Michael, in turn, replied that Aegis had firmly stated that he would not leave until he saw his beloved, and despite her refusal, he was ready to stand in front of her house as long as it took waiting for her decision and hoping for a meeting. The man called his sister emotionless and cold-blooded, claiming that she took things too calmly, not allowing herself to show feelings and emotions, which in his opinion made her withdrawn and alienated. Some time passed, and the maiden sat absorbed in reading, but her thoughts increasingly returned to one question. Was Aegis still sitting below, waiting for her to appear? Or had he already left, leaving her in thoughts and worries about their meeting? The letters floated before her eyes, and the maiden felt that the moment had come for a break to give rest to her tired eyes, and to the thoughts that were absorbing her too much. She decided to get up and take a little walk to refresh her thoughts. The noblewoman stood up and decided to go out to rest, get some fresh air and a change of scenery, as she felt that she needed a little time to come to her senses and bring clarity back to her thoughts, which were losing their clarity. Suddenly, on the way to her chambers, the beauty stopped. Her heart slightly sank, and she thought about the possibility that Aegis still had not left and continued to wait for her, despite her silence and refusal, and this made her think about her feelings. The aristocrat stood before the closed doors, her gaze fixed forward, but her thoughts were racing through her head, giving her no peace. She wondered what awaited her behind those doors, how her decision could change everything, and whether she was ready to accept the consequences. The lady went outside to check her guess, and seeing that it was correct, she froze, blushing from surprise and excitement, not believing her eyes, but feeling her heart beat faster. There, under the light of the street lamps, the Duke was already waiting for her, with a smile on his face full of joy and impatience to see her after a long separation, and his look said a lot. He was happy to meet her again. The faces of the young couple gradually approached, and there were only a few centimeters between them. The air was filled with tension that could not go unnoticed, as if everything around froze in anticipation of their next step. Ages, feeling the piercing cold outside without further thought, began to take off his fur coat, realizing that he must first take care of her comfort immediately to protect her from the harsh weather conditions. He carefully threw a warm cloak over his companion's shoulders, trying to protect her from the piercing cold, which was becoming more noticeable with each passing moment, and his heart filled with warmth from the realization that he could be her support at this moment. The man added that his desire to see his beloved was so strong that he could not restrain himself and came to her despite any obstacles and difficulties, ready to meet her right now. Suddenly, as if by some invisible force, the beauty gently placed her hand on the guy's cheek, and this touch was so gentle that he felt its warmth, as if the world around him had disappeared, leaving only this momentary moment. Quietly, and with a little regret, Siren said that now that Aegis had seen her, it was time to part, and he, no matter how hard it was, had to leave so as not to upset the careful balance that had existed between them until that moment. However, the nobleman, despite the order, was in no hurry to obey, and without taking his eyes off the lady, squeezed her fingers in his palm, as if trying to show that he was ready to fight for her attention despite all obstacles. Siren, keeping her wariness in check, agreed with his words, stating that she would stay with him, but only on the condition that he could prove his worth and earn her trust, since she was not used to bestowing her affection without reason. Rudely, but with genuine interest, the lady asked what exactly this handsome man meant, because in her opinion, he had already achieved considerable heights, and she could not understand what else was needed to prove his importance in her eyes. The girl's eyes widened in surprise when Aegis, with complete determination in his voice, declared that he would make her empress, as if it was the only possible option for both of them, and there was not the slightest hint of a joke in his words. With even greater confidence, Aegis repeated his words, not ironically, but speaking completely seriously as never before, convincing her that his intentions were unchanged and he was ready to go to the end to fulfill his promise. To herself, deeply surprised, and even slightly alarmed, she thought that the Duke had finally gone mad, deciding to commit high treason, because such words and actions could cost him everything he had ever achieved. It was obvious to the aristocrat that the idea of becoming a ruler did not appeal to his beloved, and he noticed how she looked at him with anxiety and doubt, as if her heart could not accept such a future full of uncertainty. On the day Aegis left, the lady never had time to tell him the sad news of his father's death, and as a symbol of this loss, the white flowers in the vase fell, filling the room with heavy silence and unspoken grief. Siren asked in surprise if the guy really intended to destroy this country without realizing all the consequences of his decisions, because in her opinion, such actions could lead to a catastrophe for the entire state. With a smile that brought a slight blush to his cheeks, Aegis replied that he really didn't care. He was prepared to destroy the empire, and even his own duchy of Achernia, if it served his purposes, without hesitating for a moment. Kissing a lock of his companion's hair, he said with tenderness and determination that only she was important to him, Siren whom he loved madly and desperately, and no one else could take her place in his heart. After she saw the man off who was moving away from her, the girl, leaning tiredly against the closed door, sighed quietly, experiencing the weight of the recent conversation, which left a deep mark on her soul. Once in her chambers, she began to take off her slippers, as if trying to free herself from the heavy thoughts that were haunting her, and finally surrendered to the silence that reigned around her. After which, with a slight sigh, she settled herself on the bed and covered her face with her hand, as if she wanted to hide from the whole world. 2 years ago, she had made up her mind to avoid the Duke, but despite her attempts, he was already hopelessly in love with her. Something serious and important had happened in the past, leaving an indelible mark on their destinies. And now, looking back, she realized how quickly the clock had moved, taking them into the future, where much had changed. Then, in an attempt to find a remedy that could help the Duke get rid of his passionate obsession, the girl searched for a long time until she found a herb that could neutralize the effects of the incense that had so strongly affected his mind. Quickly, without wasting time, she prepared the medicine and hurried to take it to the aristocrat to test its effect and make sure that she had not made a mistake in her calculations, hoping that it would help bring the Duke back to reality. Siren determinedly asked her lover to drink the potion she had prepared, hoping that only in this way could he gain freedom from the influence that held him captive and regain his true identity. The girl asked in surprise if the man was really afraid that she could poison him, to which the Duke confidently replied that he had no doubt whatsoever about the lady's sincerity, and believed that she was not capable of such a thing. The Duke, without hesitating for a moment, resolutely opened the bottle and was ready to drink whatever the lady offered him, because trust and respect for her were more important to him than any doubts or fears. Aegis took the bottle without thinking about the possible consequences, and drained it in one gulp, not suspecting that this act could have consequences that would change the course of events. Suddenly, unexpectedly, the bottle slipped out of his hands and broke with a loud clang, scattering into many small pieces, creating instant chaos, and drawing everyone's attention to what had happened. The boy grabbed his head. His body shook with sharp pain, and he began to cough, unable to control his reaction to what was happening, which only increased the anxiety of those around him. Siren, filled with anxiety, quickly approached and began to persistently ask if the Duke was nearby, because she expected a completely different reaction, more calm and balanced. But her question did not bring comfort. The woman's hands began to tremble, and disturbing thoughts flashed through her head. It had occurred to her more than once that the relationship with the guy could get much worse when he realized that his feelings and love for her were imposed on him through artificial intervention. The purple eyes were so intense and piercing that they seemed to belong to a wild beast ready to attack, which only added to the tension in the room. The beauty anxiously wondered if the nobleman had now begun to hate her because his feelings could have changed, and she did not know what his heart was hiding after everything that had happened, which worried her more and more. Suddenly, Siren felt her body lose its strength, and she began to fall onto the bed as hands pressed down on her shoulders with determination, and the Duke loomed over her like a shadow, his presence overwhelming and unearthly. The young man's arm wrapped tightly around the beauty's neck, and feeling the strong pressure, she began to cough, trying to get rid of the chokehold, which seemed too painful and unexpected to her. The man seemed ready to take her life. His intentions were ruthless, but suddenly he froze. His rage subsided, and he burst into tears. Tears fell silently, causing his face to distort with deep inner fear and despair. Siren had already thought more than once that when the creature returned to the Duke, he would most likely want revenge. She was sure that he would not spare her, because he would decide to finish off this villainess who had caused irreparable damage to his mind and mental state. The woman's hand lay softly and soothingly on his, as a symbol of tenderness and support, even at that moment when his heart was full of anger and hatred towards her, and it seemed that not a single good feeling could remain between them. The siren continued to sound, growing louder and more alarming, with each passing moment echoing in the air, which was becoming thinner and thinner, and breathing was becoming labored, as if there wasn't enough oxygen for everyone. The girl remained alive despite all the trials and ages, as if succumbing to a sudden weakness, lay down next to her, closing his eyes, and as if losing consciousness, as if all his strength had left him at that moment. The girl slowly rose, thinking that everything that had happened to her was just a nightmare, but the dark marks on her neck left after the night cruelly reminded her that it was not a dream, but a reality full of terrible experiences. In the mirror, the woman saw strange marks on her body that caused her a wave of anxiety and worry, leaving her confused and deeply saddened by the realization of what had happened. Then the lady, without thinking for a minute, immediately left the estate, deciding that there was no longer any point in staying in this place where her presence was already unnecessary and her whole future life required changes. The beauty quickly slipped away, and only later realized that Aegis had completely forgotten about what had happened between them, and about his hatred for her, as if it had all been just a bad dream that he did not want to remember. Looking down, the noblewoman realized that from the moment she left him, she began to avoid the Duke, feeling anxious and strangely insecure at every memory of him. The pen, as if out of habit, smoothly sank into the inkwell, and drops of black liquid began to spread, reflecting the shadow of her thoughts as a symbol of the fact that her thoughts still could not calm down and find their form. The girl quickly began writing the letter on old yellowed paper, trying to convey all her thoughts as quickly as possible, as if afraid that the words might slip from her mind before she had time to write them down. It took a lot of time to describe the required plant, since it grew exclusively on the tops of snow-covered mountains, where the air was rare, and nature itself was a harsh and almost inaccessible element for man. With her hands folded in front of her, Siren fell into deep thought, trying to find a way to get the rare plant to save the Duke, because getting this plant was incredibly difficult, and preparing medicine from it required not only time, but also special knowledge. However, soon there was enough information about the necessary medicine, and the notes she collected allowed her to put together a complete picture, giving hope for a successful solution to the problem, despite all the difficulties that stood in her way. The problem, however, was the elves with whom humans currently had an extremely tense relationship, which created additional difficulties in finding a solution, despite the fact that the two races had previously lived in much greater harmony. This was not always the case. Previously, a strong and reliable symbol of mutual understanding between the two races was the handshake, which signified friendly relations and mutual respect, on the basis of which many important alliances and agreements were built. Elves were known for their exceptional healing abilities and the ability to neutralize any poison, making them indispensable allies. However, 30 years ago, a tragedy occurred that put an end to centuries of harmony. It all began when the daughter of the elven chieftain and the prince of the empire began a romance that seemed likely to lead to the union of two great nations. But for some unknown reason, the heir to the throne killed his beloved, the daughter of the elven king, and her death became the beginning of a deep feud between the races, destroying the trust and unity that had existed before. A long and bitter war began between the two races, which engulfed their peoples and led to endless quarrels, disturbing the peace and tranquility that had previously existed in their relations. The conflict became increasingly intense. The emperor, whose cruelty was known far beyond the borders of his kingdom, ignored all the protests and indignations of the elves, confident that their discontent was nothing more than a minor irritation that was not worth attention, unwilling to admit his own mistakes. Ultimately, a cruel punishment befell the race. Those who refused to submit and retreat faced the death penalty punishment for their resistance and unwillingness to accept the decision of the authorities, which they considered unjust. The wrath of the elves pierced the sky like a furious storm, and in its wake, deep hatred and enmity between the races flared up, leading to an inevitable split and the beginning of a destructive conflict that engulfed all their lands. Putting the brush with ink to her lips, the girl plunged into deep thought, realizing that in order to cure the Duke, she needed only one elf with extensive knowledge in the field of healing, and her hope was on him. Only a member of this race could help neutralize the destructive effects of the disease, which left the nobleman in a state that did not allow his mind and consciousness to return to normal. Luckily, the girl still had one more option, and it was to look for an elf on the black market, which could be the last chance to save the nobleman's life and restore his mind. Placing her hand on the sheet, the beauty remembered that the original novel mentioned how not only people were sold on the black market, but also other rare, sometimes dangerous things that could become the key to solving her problem. One of the elves was sitting behind bars, deprived of free will, and his fate was decided by those who deliberately isolated him from everything that could awaken in him independence and the possibility of fighting for his freedom. In the original, the main character, having learned about the existence of the black market, decides to save an elf captured by villains, the chieftain's son, and thus enlists their support, which becomes the key to solving many problems. Looking away, the lady wondered who among her acquaintances could help her to carry out her cunning plan. Soon the idea of a person who could render assistance occurred to her, and his name immediately came to mind. In the original, Viscount Kalen was brutally murdered by the Duke, and his death, a tragic turn of events, left everyone in complete disarray, leaving him unable to avenge his wrongs or escape the treacherous blow. Realizing that she would not have another chance to save the aristocrat, the girl stood up from her workplace, her heart filled with determination and anxiety, because not only his fate, but also the future of her entire world depended on her actions. The knights were breathing heavily from fatigue. Their bodies were exhausted from long journeys and battles. But despite all the difficulties, they were happy to see their mistress, gratitude and relief shone in their eyes, because she remained their hope. The lady smiled sweetly at the boys, greeting them with a warm and friendly smile that filled their hearts with peace and confidence, as if her presence could ease any difficulties and give hope for a better future. While the guards were rejoicing at the arrival of the lady, Michael calmly asked why his relative had come here. His gaze was cold and attentive as always when it came to the actions of her family, which he treated with caution. When asked if he was busy, the man answered in the affirmative, accompanying his answer with a slight smile full of hidden vindictiveness, recalling the lady's words spoken earlier, which sounded like a promise of invisible revenge. Stubbornly, Siren sat down on the bench next to him, and despite his silence, resolutely declared that she would wait for her brother. As long as it took, her determination was as unchangeable as a stone wall, and nothing could shake it. With a smile, the beauty said that she needed something from a relative, namely an invitation to an event that could change her destiny, namely an invitation to a mysterious event that she had dreamed of for so long. The invitation meant an opportunity to enter an illegal auction where rare and dangerous items from the black market were being sold, a deal that could lead to great risks for her, but also open up unimaginable opportunities. Tosipo was a nickname the Viscount often used, and Michael knew it well, for he himself belonged to a circle of trusted people where the family name lost its importance, and the pseudonym became part of a complex game. In his hometown, he was as vicious as Siren, and together they committed the most terrible and immoral acts each day, plunging themselves deeper into the abyss of villainy, depriving themselves of any moral compass. Stubbornly folding his arms across his chest, the brother lied, asking his sister how he knew about such an invitation, his words sounding cold and insincere, hiding behind them a desperate attempt to avoid the truth. Despite the clarity of the situation, Michael kept a cold and detached expression on his face, but in reality, emotions were raging inside him, and the nervous tension was almost impossible to hide. He carefully controlled himself, trying not to betray the anxiety that had gripped him. The man leaned towards his relative, and with suppressed irritation, said that this was not information she should know, to which the lady replied with slight disdain that then he should be more careful about such important information, after which Siren smiled again. Her gaze was confident, and she asked her brother to get her this invitation. Her words sounded like an order, but they also contained a subtle request that could not be ignored. Extending her hand upward, the lady added that in exchange for his help, she would offer him her blood, the very blood that he liked so much. Her words sounded with unexpected sincerity, promising him something valuable in exchange for his service. Human blood held the secret of magic, and Michael once said that Siren had good blood that could be the key to great power. And this revelation did not leave his mind until he decided to use it for his experiments. The man, having once made up his mind, used the girl's blood for an experiment, but something went wrong, and instead of the expected results, his actions led to unpredictable consequences that made him doubt his determination. After the experiment, Siren felt strange and not very well. Her body seemed alien, and her mind was filled with unclear sensations. Because of this, she strictly forbade her brother to take her blood in the future, realizing that the consequences could be unpredictable. When Michael began to doubt and hesitate, the maiden, looking at him, added that in exchange for his help, she would give him 10% of the income from her springs. Her offer sounded like a deal he could not refuse, especially considering her promises. Last year, the beauty received precious stones from her lover, which became not only a symbol of his love, but also significantly increased her fortune, making her truly rich and secure, opening up new horizons for her. Michael loomed over his relative and asked desperately if he really looked like a man who was willing to sacrifice his own sister for the sake of one experiment. His voice sounded full of doubt and uncertainty, as if he himself did not believe in his actions. Suddenly, with a frightening smile, the man declared that he was not such a bad person. However, adding with cold determination that if she really wanted his help next time, she should ask him harder. After which, Michael turned away abruptly, and without saying another word, walked away, his figure disappearing into the darkness, leaving behind only a shadow of what had once been a familiar care and close feelings. The girl suddenly laughed, a loud, ringing laugh that seemed to have nothing to do with what had just happened. Her laugh sounded like a challenge, as if she was confident of her victory, despite all the difficulties. Suddenly, a magical weapon appeared in front of the nobleman's throat, barely touching his skin, leaving only 1 centimeter before death, and a cold breath of threat was felt in the air, causing his heart to beat faster. In a cold voice, with a cold confidence in her voice, the lady stated that she could have pierced him with her sword. If it had been a little longer, her words sounded like a warning, but there was also a slight mockery hidden in them. Michael easily gripped the magic blade with his hand, without feeling the slightest pain. He was so strong that magic could not affect his body, and his fortitude and determination inspired respect and fear. The boy was clearly furious. His face and gestures showed the anger raging inside him, and the magic he had just held in his hands disappeared instantly, as if it had never existed, leaving behind only a dark shadow of power. Michael did not hold back his anger. His body trembled with rage as he reminded her that he had already warned her before. If she decided to attack him again, he would not stand aside and would certainly respond to her aggression without showing the slightest weakness. The man felt a chill as he realized with alarm that his warning might not have gotten through to her. He nervously wondered how that was possible when he had made it so clear that he would no longer tolerate her aggression. The common weapons that the heavy warriors trained with now stood next to the stone wall, long spears and heavy axes ready for battle. These objects served not only as tools of battle, but also as symbols of strength. Suddenly, the young man swung his hand sharply, and snow-white magic swirled around him, filling the space with sparkling energy. Siren, feeling the power, shuddered in surprise, and involuntarily retreated, feeling anxious. The girl, full of determination, and not one to back down, used her powerful red magic, determined that she would achieve her goal and receive the invitation no matter what obstacles stood in her way. The fight came to an end when Michael, with cold determination, pointed his blade forward, and without taking his eyes off his sister, quietly asked if she was ready to continue this senseless fight, despite all the possible consequences. Siren, full of bewilderment, asked why her brother was so against her, joining the auction, not understanding the reasons for his harsh attitude towards her decision, which seemed quite reasonable under the circumstances. The relative, however, responded with restraint and brevity that he had never allowed her to visit the black market, while continuing to hold the gun at her throat, as if reminding her of his power and responsibility for her safety. Siren understood perfectly well that the guy often looked at her as a fragile flower in a greenhouse, weak and defenseless, but she was ready to prove to him that her strength and determination were much greater than he could imagine. For him, she remained the same child she had been in childhood, always in need of care and protection. And despite her changes, he could not see in her an adult and strong person capable of standing up for herself and making independent decisions. Suddenly, the lady closed her eyes, moved sharply to the side, and without looking at her brother, calmly asked if he was going to strike, as if she was not afraid of his actions, confident in her ability to control the situation. A step forward, and the man staggered sharply, feeling how a sudden blow, like a bolt from the blue, knocked the ground out from under his feet, causing him to lose his balance and instinctively grip his weapon tighter, preparing for the next collision. The red and black blades met in a fierce battle. Their blades collided with such a roar that sparks flew, and the battle itself became even more fierce, filling with fury and tension. Michael continued to call his sister weak, while not forgetting to claim that he did not have a single vulnerable point, and his strength and determination were impeccable, like an iron wall that could not be destroyed. When her brother struck her very hard, her cousin held back the pain, and despite the gravity of the situation, laughed it off, showing that her spirit could not be broken, and she was ready to fight to the end. Ignoring her brother's persistent pleas to stop the fight and surrender, Siren stubbornly stood on her feet, clutching her sword as if she was ready to fight to the last, not allowing herself to weaken. Suddenly, the boy turned around and without saying a word began to walk away, leaving only a shadow behind him, as if he had decided that continuing the fight was pointless and that his goal had already been achieved. The only way to win was to use magic, which required not only deep knowledge and complex artifacts, but also enormous resources to awaken its power to its full potential. Having repelled another powerful blow from the enemy's blade, The girl realized that if she wanted to win, she would need magic, because no physical technique was capable of defeating such a strong and experienced enemy standing in front of her. Suddenly, as if by some invisible force, the beauty fell and her back hit the ground with a dull sound, and the world around her faded, leaving only pain and the realization that the fight was not over. When the lady decided to use her magic suddenly, the blade pierced the woman's flesh. The beautiful siren felt pain, but resolutely refused to retreat. The man's eyes, filled with horror, widened in surprise, and their gray hue became even duller. He did not know what to do because it was completely unclear to him whether he really wanted to hurt his sister or just scare her. In horror and confusion, he asked why the lady did not cover herself and tried to deflect the blow despite the obvious threat and danger that hung over her at that very moment when the decision was critical. However, in response to his question, Siren calmly explained that she had carefully calculated her actions and at the right moment cast a powerful magic spell that was supposed to destroy the threat and neutralize it once and for all. A bright, blinding light suddenly flared up in the square, as if a ray of heaven itself had cut through the thick darkness, dissecting it with its radiance, and instantly filled the space with magical energy, causing those around to be eclipsed by its power. The noblewoman stood motionless, looking down, where her gaze met the figure of the knight, a skilled swordsman, but so vulnerable in the magical arts, unlike his sister. Suddenly, Michael spoke in a loud and confident voice, declaring that he would demand 30% of all mines owned by his relative in exchange for his help in the upcoming affairs, emphasizing that his demands were more than just an agreement. Siren, hearing this, smiled, her face filled with a cunning expression, and she replied that then if the conditions were met, she would eagerly await an invitation to the auction from her relative because she knew exactly how to get her way. Raising her finger up, she thoughtfully recalled a page from a book about the Great Imperial Rebellion, adding that at that moment she felt quite satisfied because her brother, who had suffered defeat, clearly did not expect such a turn of events. Michael, chuckling, couldn't help but smile slightly as he noticed how his sister, with her decisive and witty approach, had slightly scared him, as if her words weren't just a joke, but a real challenge. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the night, alleys, a figure in a dark cloak moved in silence, leaving only a mysterious shadow behind him, hiding his true intentions and not allowing anyone to reveal his plans. It was Siren, whose face was hidden behind a mask, and her figure was carefully concealed because no one should know her identity, and even her presence in this place seemed like a mystery that no one could solve. The man guarding the entrance to the secret auction demanded that the noblewoman show her invitation before allowing her to enter, for he knew how important it was to adhere to strict rules and could not afford to compromise on this matter. The lady handed the guard the letter of invitation, and after he had examined it carefully, she was allowed inside, allowing her to continue on her way, confident and calm, despite all the mysterious circumstances surrounding this evening. Soon a gentleman appeared, who was the owner of the dark establishment, and approaching the honorable guest, who had a special invitation, he greeted him with an air of full respect, knowing that such a person was worthy of consideration. Siren, in her male form, suddenly felt her brother's influence spreading throughout the underworld, reminding her of how deep her connection to that world was, and how its shadows could haunt her at the most unexpected moments. The lady, not wanting to waste time and lose her chance, immediately asked about the mysterious elf that interested her, deciding that she was ready to buy him out because her plans were clear and she was not going to miss the opportunity to get her hands on him. The gentleman smiled and watched with interest the guest, who seemed to be genuinely interested in the elf, and his attention was drawn to how this representative of a special race could be useful or even play an important role in his own affairs. Not wanting to wait until the auction was over to finally acquire the elf, Siren would quietly call one of her subordinates to tell her the exact location of the elf she so badly wanted to see and possibly acquire. The gentleman who organized the auction did not hesitate to give his permission to let them in and show them the product of the evening, fully aware that this event attracted the attention of the most influential guests, among whom was Siren. Mentally thanking her brother for the help that showed up at the right moment, Siren confidently approached the closed door, feeling the tension growing with every step, because behind this door was hidden not just a cage, but its goal. There, in a cramped cage, sat the figure of a man who cried tirelessly to be let out, his voice, sounding in the silence of the night, like a cry for help, full of despair and hope for freedom. Siren, who was closely watching what was happening at the black market, could not help but have dark thoughts, because what she saw was much more terrible than she could have imagined in her worst nightmare. The owner of the auction, addressing the esteemed guest with deep respect, apologized for the noise, which could probably irritate him, and promised that he would try to make the atmosphere more comfortable for everyone present. Finally, after a long journey, they reached the desired place where the dungeon was illuminated only by the dim light of a torch, which barely illuminated the dark corners, creating a strange feeling of mystery and danger in this place. They stopped near one of the cages, examining it with caution, as if something dangerous might be hidden inside, that required attentiveness and readiness for unexpected events. Inside the cage sat a handsome elf man who seemed to be in deep sleep, but his body was covered in bruises and dirt, indicating that he had been through long and painful suffering. Suddenly, his eyes opened, and they were a bright green, full of anger and hatred, which looked so intense that it seemed as if his entire being was radiating anger and a desire for revenge for the torment he had endured. His body was clearly marked with bruises from the brutal abuse he had endured, and every trace of pain spoke of how much he had suffered and how much cruelty he had experienced during that time. Siren, sensing that the situation required caution, asked the other gentleman to step back a little so that she could personally inspect and dispose of her goods without being subjected to unnecessary interference or tense stares. The auction owner, stopping in bewilderment, asked again what the guest had meant when she sent him away, since he did not fully understand why she needed to intervene and what exactly she was going to do with this strange product. Siren replied briefly that he was in her way, and with a sharp gesture of her hand, indicated that he should leave immediately, making room for further action. Her words were resolute, and her gaze was full of ruthless severity. Her gaze was cold and hard like an icy wind, and she made it clear that this was the last warning for the illegal goods dealer. He was to leave without interfering with the plans and not create new problems. Finally, the man, frightened by the gesture and expression on the lady's face, agreed to carry out the order and hurriedly left the room, his steps sounding hollow as if he was trying to get away as quickly as possible. The elf, despite the noise and what was happening around him, did not react to the presence of a new person in the dungeon. His gaze remained empty and alienated, and his body remained motionless, as if he had already lost all hope of salvation. Even in the dust and dirt, this man remained a true work of beauty, the embodiment of his race, with long, slightly disheveled hair, pointed ears, and skin that, despite the torment, retained its purity and flawlessness. Siren stared thoughtfully through the bars, wondering if she would be able to save the elf, or if he was already so broken that bringing him back to life would be impossible, and saving him would be just a dream. With a tilt of her head and a slight smile on her lips, Siren confidently said that no matter what, she still wanted to buy a representative of the magical race, because his strength and capabilities were too valuable to pass up. Standing next to the bars, the lady added that she would save the man and help him get out of this dangerous and unpleasant place in which he found himself condemning himself to a difficult fate. The lady, clutching the prison bars tightly with her hand, looked at him in surprise, and asking a question, asked if he was curious to know why she had decided to buy him, since it was such an unexpected and unconventional act on her part. When asked if he wanted to go home, the guy lowered his gaze slightly, as if immersed in his thoughts, and was silent for a long time, not knowing how to answer, because these words made him think about his future and the path he had chosen. The lady managed to attract the elf's attention by saying that after purchasing it, she would definitely give him freedom as soon as he fulfilled his destiny, and this promise touched his soul, opening up new perspectives. The blue mystical light emanating from the candles on the chandelier enveloped the dark corners of the dungeon, creating a mysterious atmosphere in which every movement seemed mysterious and full of hidden meanings. The girl admitted that she needed something in exchange for saving him, and her voice sounded a little excited, as if she was willing to pay any price for the opportunity to get what she so desperately sought. The elf asked curiously what exactly she wanted from him, his eyes searching her words for an answer, because he was sure that behind such a request, there was something important and possibly dangerous for both of them. Siren reminded him that the guy has unique abilities and talent in healing, and can also neutralize the side effects that could arise in the process, offering him her help in exchange for help. The man stood up when Siren said she needed help in preparing one of the antidotes, and his gaze became focused. He knew that this could be a decisive moment for their further actions. The guy stood right in front of the guest and asked warily how he could trust her words, because everything she said sounded too ridiculous and bold to be true, especially in such a situation. Siren closed her eyes and calmly explained that she had come here specifically to buy it, and would not do all this just like that, because her intentions were clear, and she knew that her words had to convince him of the truth of her intentions. Covering her mouth with her hand, the girl added that she had no evidence that could confirm her words, and she understood that in this situation, trust was the only thing she could count on. After that, she decisively removed the mask from her face that hid her identity, and finally, her real face appeared before him, like a veil being lifted, revealing the whole truth about who she really was, which became a real revelation for the man. The man's eyes widened in surprise. He could not hide his shock, because everything he knew about this woman turned out to be false, and now in front of him stood not the one he accepted, but a completely different person whose true intentions became a mystery to him. The protagonist of the novel, following the knightly code, which dictated him to help everyone who was in trouble, ended up on the black market, where despite the danger, he saved everyone in need without thinking about the risks, because saving lives was the most important thing for him. However, Siren had a completely different reason for saving the elf. She needed to prepare an antidote, and her actions were aimed precisely at achieving this goal, and not at a simple desire to help, as it might seem at first glance. Siren lowered her head as her hand was extended through the bars to shake hands and formalize their agreement, symbolizing her agreement with the terms the elf had proposed, and began to understand the importance of this moment. And so the hands joined and words were spoken about how the promise had to be kept, because it was not just a gesture, but something more that determined their future relationship and certain obligations on both sides. The elf introduced himself as Ekelt, and from that moment, their acquaintance became official, and subsequent events, oddly enough, led them to an unexpected and somewhat tense relationship that promised to be full of twists and turns. On the guy's wrist was a gold bracelet with a mysterious pattern, unusual and enigmatic, which attracted Siren's attention, and she could not help but notice how important this accessory was to him, hiding some special secret within itself. The ornament appeared in the hands of the maiden, and she, carefully placing it on her wrist, raised her hands up, saying that this would be proof of their contract, a symbol of their agreement, and at the same time would not harm him as he might think. Siren then showed a second bracelet exactly the same as the first, and by placing it on her arm, she confirmed the seriousness of her intentions, demonstrating that their agreement was mutual and official. She put the bracelet on her arm, and a contract was made between them, sealed by this symbolic gesture, which meant the beginning of their mutual obligations and understanding in their difficult situation. Suddenly, Siren remembered that the auction was about to start, and she should leave as quickly as possible so as not to attract unnecessary attention to herself, because the situation could become too dangerous if she remained in plain sight. Putting the mask on her face, she immediately turned around and walked away without looking back. But before leaving, she told the elf not to worry if there was any commotion, because it could have been part of her plan, and he shouldn't have interfered. The Great Red Hall was a place of illegal trading where not only goods were valued, but also connections and influence, creating an atmosphere in which each participant was forced to hide their true goals and intentions. Siren stood on the balcony, thinking that the seats in the hall were distributed depending on the guest's rank, and the higher the status, the closer to the center of what was happening, which did not escape her attention. Suddenly, a loud voice was heard signaling the start of trading, and the heavy red curtains began to slowly open, allowing the participants to see what awaited them behind the curtain. New opportunities or more dangers. Siren leaned her chin on her fist, tiredly, showing no interest in the start of the auction, since jewelry and luxury items had not attracted her for a long time, and her thoughts were occupied with much more important and personal matters. The host announced loudly that the auction would begin with expensive jewelry and then move on to artifacts. His voice was confident, creating an atmosphere of anticipation where everyone in the room knew that incredible lots were waiting for them. Coins rained down on the table, and the bidding began at once, filling the room with sounds of excitement and commotion. Every offer, every gesture was accompanied by the tense attention of those present. The noblewoman yawned, languishing in anticipation of the auction finally ending. She could barely contain her boredom, absorbed in thoughts of how she would like to quickly leave this place in order to return to more important matters. After the decorations were sold out, a man with a striking appearance, clearly standing out from the rest, noted that they were now moving on to the second part of the event, where the stakes would become even more intense and dangerous for the participants. The elf, the last lot, was presented before them. His graceful figure seemed to shine in the dim light, and his gaze, full of mystery and ancient wisdom, attracted attention, making everyone wonder what secrets he could hide. One by one, the nobles raised their numbers, offering ever higher sums for the rare item, their eyes full of excited anticipation, and the atmosphere became increasingly tense as everyone sought to get their hands on the valuable item at any cost. The elf looked up, his head raised, waiting for his companion to raise her number to redeem him. This was their contract, their agreed-upon condition that would conclude this strange and important moment of their interaction. Suddenly, Siren raised her number, and with an expression of complete confidence in her voice, loudly declared that she was betting a whole 500,000 gold, attracting everyone's attention and arousing the interest and respect of those around her for her generosity. The host, stunned by such a large sum, was speechless for a moment, his face frozen in surprise, and he, slightly nervous, asked with confusion if anyone could offer a higher sum than this. Suddenly, a voice came from the other side, in which a man standing nearby confidently offered an incredible 5 million gold for the elf, thereby causing a wave of shock and anticipation in the room. The masked nobles began to whisper among themselves in surprise, trying to comprehend how such a huge sum could have been offered for the lot, discussing every detail with curiosity and admiration, not believing their ears. The host, stunned by what was happening, could not believe his words, and in the end asked the guest again whether he was really ready to pay such a fantastic price for the elf, doubting the seriousness of the offer. The mysterious man, hidden under a hood and veil, nodded reservedly, confirming his consent without revealing his identity, but thereby further increasing the mystery and interest in his participation in the auction. Thus, a dispute ensued between Siren and the mysterious man over who would offer the largest sum, and their shouts and offers echoed throughout the hall, attracting the attention of everyone present and creating a tense atmosphere. Siren was completely taken aback by the amount the man had offered, and despite her determination, she couldn't help but wonder if she would be able to match his generosity and offer more. At this time, Michael, absolutely tired after a long day and difficult experiences, was calmly resting on the bed, yawning and falling asleep, not having the slightest idea what his sister was doing at this time. The boy's body was covered in bandages after a brutal battle, and he felt every pain, every movement brought him a painful feeling of discomfort. The wounds were serious, and recovery took time, but still he was worried not about himself, but about his sister. He was worried about her despite his own physical suffering, because from childhood, he had been her protector and support, caring for her, trying to protect her from all the troubles and misfortunes that could affect her. Even in this state, his thoughts were occupied only with her safety. Michael, with a warm smile on his face, recalled childhood moments when he held his little sister in his arms, walking with her on green lawns, feeling her joyful laughter and innocent questions that warmed his heart. Night had already fallen, which meant that the auction should have started long ago, and although he was absorbed in thoughts of the past deep down, he knew that an important event could not wait, and time was of the essence. Looking at the ceiling, Michael realized that his sister was strong and capable of coping with any difficulties. But despite her strength and independence, he could not get rid of anxiety and constant worries for her safety. His bandaged hand clutched the fabric of the blanket tightly, and in this simple yet intense gesture, it was clear that he was trying to cope with the emotions that tormented his heart, making him think about what would happen to her future. Meanwhile, Aegis sat in his study, his chin in his hand, a tired expression on his face, and on the table in front of him lay a letter containing an important request from his brother concerning the care of his sister Michael. On the yellowed paper was a request. The brother asked the Duke to take care of his sister because despite her strength, she could not do without support, and Michael was too beaten to cope on his own. With this letter, Michael, feeling helpless, asked the Duke to personally go to the auction and look after the girl to make sure she was safe and protected at this important time in her life. Gritting his teeth tightly, the man thought angrily about what the real reason could be, that his beloved was in such a terrible place where her life was at risk, and his heart was filled with bitterness from this. His fingers clutching the letter turned white with rage, and with every word he felt his anger grow, and thoughts about what had happened became even more restless and dark, tormenting his mind. No matter how expensive and exquisite gifts the Duke tried to win her attention, Siren always rejected them, not paying the slightest attention, even to beautiful flowers or luxurious boxes, which only increased his anxiety. Closing his eyes and taking a deep breath, Aegis tried to console himself with the thought that his beloved, despite all the circumstances, would hardly decide to buy a man on the black market, although anxiety remained in his soul. The man immediately recognized who the siren at the auction was the moment he saw her. Her height, red eyes, and facial features were all too recognizable, and it immediately caught his attention, making his heart beat faster with excitement. Looking at the lady hidden under a black veil, the Duke could not look away, amazed by her extraordinary beauty, which literally captivated him, making him forget about time and those around him. Perhaps the lady had come here for the rare and expensive jewelry, thinking about how to add something valuable to her collection. But anxiety began to creep into his mind when she didn't make a single bid. The lots were sold out one after another, and the Duke felt more and more uneasy each time, noticing that his beloved was not buying anything, but was only sitting in the shadows, as if waiting for something that had not yet arrived. Watching her every reaction closely, Aegis watched the noblewoman, waiting for her to finally show her interest and raise her number, signaling that her time had come. Finally, a beautiful elf with golden hair and green eyes was brought onto the stage, and the audience involuntarily froze, admiring his appearance. But for Aegis, this moment became an unexpected shock, as he did not expect what happened. Aegis opened his eyes in shock and froze, hearing the voice of his beloved, who offered him a large sum of money to do something he could not even think of. The man did not expect such words from her, and even more so, such betrayal. At this point, the handsome man decided to make things more difficult for the lady, and announced an incredibly high amount, realizing that this would be a real test of her determination and ability to make a difficult decision. Siren wasn't going to give in either, and without hesitation, she added a few more gold pieces to his price, making it clear that she was ready to go to any lengths to set him a task that he wouldn't dare complete. The elven representative, watching the proceedings closely, couldn't help but wonder if he could buy Siren back when the man, without hesitation, loudly announced the amount of 70 million gold, causing surprise among everyone present. When the lady was about to raise her price even higher, the door suddenly swung open, frightening everyone present, and they froze, not understanding what was happening. A guy with short hair entered the room, covered in blood and dirt, staggering from weakness. His face and clothes were dirty, and his eyes reflected unbearable pain and fatigue. But he stood on his feet despite all his wounds. Bowing his head before his master, he loudly declared that they were in trouble because the guard had encountered unexpected difficulties, and a squad of knights was heading towards them who had uncovered their black market, threatening their entire business. Siren sighed heavily when she learned that the protagonist had finally arrived, like in some old book, determined to liberate the oppressed, and the weak not realizing that his actions could lead to much more serious consequences. Hipron Eights entered the building with a cold, angry look, his expression leaving no doubt. He was not looking for justice, but only striving for his goal, not caring who stood in his way. Having strictly ordered all the nobles to remain where they were, Hipron Eights then ordered his guards to catch anyone who tried to escape, leaving no one the slightest chance of escape. The voice sounded decisive and threatening, and no one dared to object. Siren was well aware that escaping would not be easy, and so she decided to observe the actions of the leader of the Black Wolves Knights, for now trying to understand his intentions and readiness for possible resistance before making any decisions. After this, the lady turned sharply, and without looking back, headed towards the exit of the hall as if trying to hide from all eyes, confident that she would be able to leave this place unnoticed. Siren panicked and ran quickly, leaving the place not wanting to be caught and exposed. She was ready to do anything to remain unnoticed and avoid the fate that awaited her. On the stairs running down, she collided with one of the knights standing in the passage, and he, noticing her, ordered her to leave immediately, as if warning that further delay would have serious consequences. The man, covered with many scars, said loudly that the masked guest would be better off surrendering without resistance. For resistance was only a path to a painful reprisal, which he could not avoid if he did not give in. The lady began to rummage through the pockets of her robe, in a hurry, desperately trying to find a spell that she could use to summon magic and get out of this situation without giving her opponents the slightest chance. Loudly, with a desperate intonation, the beauty declared that she could not find the necessary paper, wondering whether she should use the sword which she wielded, although not as skillfully as magic. But nevertheless, it was not alien to her. Drawing the blade from its sheath, she moved it quickly and confidently towards the guard, relying on her determination and precision, as every moment could be decisive in their confrontation. The knight stood in bewilderment as he saw the small dagger in the hands of the cloaked figure, not perceiving it as a real opponent, thinking it was just a helpless threat that did not deserve attention. However, a moment later, the blade was literally next to the guy's face, and he winced in shock and horror, realizing that he was in a mortally dangerous situation that almost cost him his life. The guard, not having time to do anything, fell from a sharp blow. His body fell powerlessly to the ground, and he lost consciousness, absorbed by instant shock and pain, which completely paralyzed him. The dagger was wrapped in magical red threads that enhanced its impact, giving the weapon an invisible force capable of breaking through any defense and defeating the enemy with incredible accuracy and power. As Siren tried to leave, she was suddenly stopped by the enemy's voice, which loudly pointed at her, preventing her from slipping away unnoticed. And at that moment, her escape was in jeopardy. At this time, she remembered the words of the strange guest, who seemed to predict the future, saying that if there was a commotion, then it was not worth running, but better to hide somewhere, wait it out and leave the storm behind. The gold bracelet on his arm sealed a contract between him and this mysterious guest, which obliged him to fulfill the promise given without the right to break the terms, even if the consequences might be unexpected. Eaglet glanced quickly at the decorations, hiding in one of the small closets, trying not to give away his presence, as if he felt how every object around him became a witness to his secrecy. Previously, the elves around him had only said one thing. How greedy and selfish humans were. Their words, full of contempt, always sounded like shadows hanging over Eaglet's soul, reminding him of the true nature of humanity. And so, one dark night, when Eaglet was praying to the higher powers to reveal to him the answer to his tormenting question, people found him and kidnapped him, taking him with them like harbingers of fate, leaving him no chance to escape. Suddenly, a man's hand appeared quickly and decisively, pushing aside the red curtain, as if breaking through the barrier that separated him from the rest of the world, disturbing the silence and tranquility of the room. It was one of the guests, who, having noticed the elf hiding in a secluded corner, could not believe his luck, because now he had a unique opportunity to become his master, to subjugate this mysterious and powerful creature. Eaglet coughed as a strong blow to his stomach robbed him of his breath and strength, causing pain to pierce his entire body. But he did not give up and continued to fight despite the physical pain and desire to resist. The man, unable to bear the pain, began to cry from rage and fear, asking himself how much longer he would have to endure this torment, how much longer he would be able to restrain his aggression without giving in under the pressure of circumstances. Suddenly, the villain who had struck the blow suddenly burst into flames. His body engulfed in flames, and he began to scream in pain, rage, and shock, not understanding how his own actions had turned against him. Eaglet closed his eyes, ready to accept his death, by the flames feeling them approaching. But after a moment in complete shock, he realized that the fire was not harming him, and for a moment he stood unable to understand what was happening. Very quickly, he realized that it was the magic of the golden bracelet that the strange stranger had given him, and that it was this bracelet that protected him from the fire, creating an invisible barrier between him and the destructive power of the flames. In complete shock, the man asked himself, almost losing his mind, why the fire had not touched him, trying to understand how his own life had been saved by a mystical force that remained a complete mystery to him. After this, the elf, without wasting time, rushed towards the exit, wanting first to get out of this terrible place, and then to find the man who promised him freedom, and perhaps to provide help in the future. The door was open, and a bright, blinding light was coming from it, as if inviting him into a new world full of promises of freedom and the beginning of a new life, as if the answers to all the questions that had long tormented his soul were hidden behind the threshold of this room. But suddenly, Eaglet lost his balance and fell to the floor, hitting his back painfully against the hard surface. At that moment, the world around him plunged into obscurity, and his thoughts were confused by pain. Legs appeared in front of him, and someone stopped next to him, not giving him even the slightest chance to move, as if admitting that his freedom could not be as easy as he had hoped. The mysterious man with short white hair and bright blue eyes stared intently at the elf, who despite everything managed to survive the blow, and a mysterious smile appeared on his face, as if he was pleasantly surprised by something. The flames quickly engulfed the furniture, and the building, everything around, became engulfed in flames, and only a few parts still tried to resist this element, engulfing everything in its path, like a wave washing away everything that stood in its path. A dangerous yet incredibly handsome nobleman stood in the middle of the hall, which was engulfed in flames, but his calm and confidence seemed unyielding, as if he was above these deadly threats, in complete control of the situation. Suddenly, the bracelet on his hand reacted, and magical sparks appeared from it, which as if alive began to dance in the air, illuminating the space around, until they formed a powerful field of magic. The boy rubbed his neck with his hand, as if trying to calm himself down, and then freed the elf lying on the floor from the magical influence of the bracelet, saying that he wanted to destroy the pig, but instead suddenly found a real treasure in front of him. Ekult sat on the floor, lost in thought, listening to the strange stranger admire his beauty. His words seemed full of surprise, but there was nothing sincere in them, and the elf felt his body weaken from this attention. The boy's consciousness began to slip away, and everything blurred before his eyes, as if reality was disappearing, swallowed up by an insurmountable fog, and he could no longer understand what was happening around him, losing touch with the present moment. Suddenly, Ekult began to fall, his body losing its support, and his consciousness could no longer hold him, feeling how his strength was rapidly leaving him, and the surrounding world seemed to dissolve into emptiness, absorbing everything around, leaving only darkness and endless silence. At that moment, he remembered how Siren had promised him that she would definitely free him and help him return to his family in exchange for his help, and those words filled with hope echoed in his heart. Holding the golden bracelet in his hand, Ekult thought that he should not have hoped for freedom in vain, realizing how easily he fell into this trap, becoming part of someone else's game, not knowing that his path would be even more painful. Suddenly, the masked guy laughed loudly, and at that moment, feeling the cold gaze on him, he finally made the decision that he would make a scarecrow out of the elf, mercilessly turning his life into a tool for his dark purposes and pleasures. The man began to lean forward, his movements precise and confident, as if he was already anticipating his victory, and Ekult, feeling the approach of mortal danger, only tensed up more in an attempt to understand how everything would turn out. Ekult felt a shudder run through his body, scared and cold, causing his body to go motionless for a moment, as his thoughts and fear began to wash over him. But he knew he couldn't let himself lose control at this point. With his last strength, the boy rushed forward, not wanting to come to terms with the thought of his inevitable death. Determined to fight to the end, ready to fight for his life, despite all the opposing forces that were beyond his strength. However, at that moment, the mysterious stranger grabbed Ekult by the head with one quick and precise movement, slamming him sharply against the surface with such force that the boy almost lost consciousness, feeling how pain gripped his body. For the man, everything that was happening seemed like just a game where he was the absolute master of the situation, and with a cruel smile, he suggested to Ekult that perhaps it would be much easier to simply kill this impudent fellow, saving himself from unnecessary problems. Meanwhile, Siren stood on the street, worried about the situation she had accidentally gotten herself into, feeling her heart squeezed with helplessness. And at that moment, a sharp blade was pointed at her throat, threatening her life with imminent danger. Standing before her was none other than Hiprun Eitz, with a cold, vicious gaze that reflected all his cruelty, and a silver sword ready to carry out the justice he believed was necessary, regardless of any excuses. The girl was afraid that if he found out who she really was, it would inevitably lead to her death, because in his eyes, she would already be an enemy with whom it would be impossible to live if the truth were revealed. They had met before, and even danced together at one of the balls, but then she was sure that their paths would not cross again. But now, in this dangerous situation, everything seemed the opposite. When Hiprun asked if she knew who he was, Siren lied confidently, stating that everyone knew of a knight hero like him, and that they probably had not met before, although there was a growing doubt in her heart that this deception would not last long. The noblewoman changed her voice, using her magical abilities to hide her identity, but despite this, the chance that he would recognize her was still too high, and she felt the tension growing with every glance he gave her. The man was the best knight in the empire, and defeating him in a duel with a cold weapon, no matter how skilled the opponent was almost impossible because his skills and strength left no chance for anyone. The main character resolutely said that he would figure out the identities of the strange guests himself when he removed their masks, no matter how hidden their intentions were, because in his eyes there was no room for doubt. The man's hand was extended towards the lady, and her movement quick and confident, as if he had no doubt of his victory, leaving no doubt about his intentions. And this gesture filled with threat was an expression of complete power and control. Siren closed her eyes in fear, hoping for a miracle, praying that fate would intervene and give her a chance at salvation, although she herself doubted that a miracle could happen at such a dark moment in her life. Suddenly, someone's hand covered Siren's eyes, and someone from behind hugged her tightly, pressing her to himself, disrupting her perception of what was happening, making her heart beat faster from not understanding what happened at that moment. Surprised, Siren began to open her eyes, not understanding what had happened, trying to comprehend who was next to her, and what kind of inexplicable feeling was taking over her at that moment, until her thoughts were confused between fear and hope. The red-haired knight remained standing, looking in surprise at the street where he had just been, and the mysterious guest in the mask disappeared somewhere, as if he had dissolved into thin air, and everything that was happening seemed incredible and unthinkable to his mind. Reaching his hand forward, he realized that magic of traveling to another place had been used, and he couldn't immediately comprehend how this was possible, because everything that was happening seemed too strange to be real. Aegis landed gently on the ground, continuing to hug the girl tenderly, his arms holding her with warmth and confidence, as if he was her protector, hiding her from everything that could threaten her at this moment. When asked who he was, the Duke recoiled, hesitating to reveal his identity, as if the weight of his title was so great that he doubted whether it was worth revealing it to a stranger at such a moment. Siren realized in shock that the magic that changed her voice was gone, and the man now knew who she really was, which immediately confused her and made her watch nervously at his reaction. The noblewoman thanked the stranger for his help. Her words were sincere, but there was still concern hidden in her eyes, and she couldn't help but ask what he was running away from, because her intuition told her that something was hidden behind his actions. The strange guy became noticeably nervous, unable to find the right words. He remained silent, and his face became tense, as if he was trying to hide something important that he did not want to talk about out loud under any circumstances. Aegis looked away when Siren pressed him if he knew who she really was, and there was something in his eyes that made her heart clench, as if he was hiding a deeper secret. The lady stubbornly continued to try to get an answer, but instead of words, silence again came in response, a deep silence that only increased her anxiety and desire to know the truth. The aristocrat turned sharply and walked towards the window, leading to the abandoned hut in which she had previously been, her steps becoming decisive, but uncertainty remained in her soul. Suddenly, the lady smiled, and in a light, almost playful tone, asked if the stranger would be kind, and would he by chance do her a favor if she would ask him to help in one modest but important matter. Even though the lady's first plan didn't work, she had prepared a second one in advance, more secretive and carefully thought out, so that she would be ready to act at any moment if the first one turned out to be ineffective in the current circumstances. It was for this reason that she handed the bracelet to the elf, which became not only a symbol of their agreement, but also an important magical artifact, cementing their mutual obligations and creating a subtle but powerful connection between them. Moreover, this decoration possessed a powerful protective power, protecting the owner from external threats and magical attacks, creating an invisible but strong aura of security around him, which provided confidence in any circumstances. The bracelet also served as a means of transmitting magic, creating a special seal under the feet of the one who wore it, which allowed the transmission of power and energy through invisible but powerful channels connecting the owner with the magical world. Before the auction began, Siren carefully drew a magic circle around the area, seeking to create a protective and mystical atmosphere that would not only strengthen her control over the situation, but also protect her from unwanted interference. The girl did this in order to get the opportunity to be in the place where the elf once was, because that was where she wanted to go, hoping to find answers to her questions and unravel the secrets that this mysterious place hides. Siren sighed heavily and began to complain that drawing complex seals in a hurry was quite difficult, and every stroke she had to apply required incredible effort because everything had to be perfect and precise. When the beauty had finished her work, she asked the stranger to direct his magical power into the circle so that she could complete the ritual that was supposed to change everything, but for this, the energy needed to be directed correctly. The man obediently fulfilled her request, and a bright purple glow burst from his fingers, which softly spread around the circle, filling the space with a mysterious glow. But despite this, the expected effect did not occur, which caused confusion. When nothing happened, Aegis sheepishly apologized, looking at the girl with a slight reproach to himself, and said that perhaps they would not succeed because the seal or ritual could have contained an error that he did not notice. But suddenly, a smaller hand lay next to his, its fingers carefully gliding over the symbols as if trying to check whether the seal had been made correctly and whether their energy could actually awaken the magic that was embedded. Siren couldn't believe her eyes when she realized that the bracelet that once belonged to the elf had been removed, but he himself couldn't do it. Apparently, someone else had intervened and helped him get rid of the magical artifact that was possibly holding back his power. Turning her attentive gaze to her companion, the girl asked a question that could not be delayed. Could she count on his help in reteleportation since time was running out, and the possibility of finding answers hung by a thread? Silently, but with complete readiness, the stranger nodded, making it clear that he was ready to fulfill her request, even if it required considerable effort from him, because their common goal was more important than any personal difficulties. Teleportation was the ultimate magic available only to a select few, and the number of those who could use it flawlessly could be counted on the fingers of one hand because it required incredible concentration, talent, and strength. Someone who could wield such magic would inevitably stand out for their skill. And this man, judging by his ease in using such a complex spell, was clearly one of the most talented sorcerers capable of manipulating space. Siren, realizing that she didn't have much time, asked the young mage to take her to the auction again, hoping that there she could find the answers that had eluded her before and reconstruct the chain of events. The Duke, frowning with obvious bewilderment in his voice, asked why she wanted to return to that terrible place full of shadows of the past, and what reason made her again face the danger that she had barely escaped. The noblewoman answered with restraint, but with a distinct note of confidence in her voice, that she had left something extremely important at the auction, without which she would not be able to move on. But she was not going to reveal what exactly it was. The Duke, with a slight mockery in his voice, stated that if her reason was only in the forgotten things, then he saw no point in helping her, and categorically refused to use his abilities to teleport again. Without losing her composure, Siren carefully took the man's hands in hers, moving closer to look him straight in the eyes, and her determination was so obvious that even the most steadfast doubts could waver under her penetrating gaze. When they finally moved to the right place, and the surroundings changed in the blink of an eye, the girl, with the grace that only a true aristocrat could have, expressed her deep gratitude to him, realizing that without his help, everything would have been much more difficult. Suddenly, he grabbed her hand sharply, not allowing her to take a single step forward, and with obvious anxiety in his voice, asked what exactly she was going to do next, because her actions seemed reckless and too risky to him. Siren, barely containing her irritation, replied that she was going to go inside to find out something that could change everything, and despite the danger, she was not going to retreat even if it could cost her too much. The Duke, wiping the sweat from his forehead, stubbornly refused to let her go further, firmly declaring that entering the fire was pure madness, and that she should not go there, because he understood how great the risk was and that her life was at stake. Siren, abruptly pulling her hand away, said with cold determination that if he intended to interfere with her, then he had better step aside, because she would not allow anyone to stop her, not even him. However, the man surprised her with an unexpected answer, when instead of retreating, he firmly stated that he would not leave her alone, and would go with her no matter how dangerous the path might be. Siren knew perfectly well that she had no reason to refuse the help of such a powerful wizard with a huge amount of mana. so without thinking, she decided to take him with her inside the building where the unknown awaited her. The Duke, with unflappable confidence in his voice, declared that even if this place turned out to be deadly dangerous, he would not regret his decision to go with her for a moment, demonstrating an iron will and determination. Touching the man's hand to use his magical power to activate the spell she needed, Siren calmly asked if he could take her to the second floor, since that was where what she was looking for was. When the noblewoman tried to clarify with her companion where exactly she needed to activate the magic to get to the right place, suddenly the chandelier engulfed in flames crashed down, smashing onto the floor and forcing them to immediately retreat back. Black smoke quickly filled the room, making breathing incredibly difficult and forcing everyone inside to fight for every breath so as not to suffocate in this stifling atmosphere. Covering her nose with her cloak so as not to inhale the toxic fumes from the burning fire, the girl feverishly thought about where the man on whom she had placed so much hope and who was her main goal could be. When asked by the man who was following her and trying to understand her true intentions, she admitted without hesitation that she was looking for that very last elf who was being put up for sale this evening as the final lot of the auction. Coolly, and with a clear dose of skepticism, the Duke noted that most likely this guy was already dead, and attempts to find him were probably in vain, since the chances of running into him were becoming smaller with each passing minute. Not giving up on finding a representative of such a rare and beautiful race, Siren reminded the man, hidden in his cloak, that he himself had shown interest in that very last lot, and perhaps knew more than he was saying. With his arms outstretched and an expression of indifference on his face, Aegis calmly stated that he had previously had a good reason for acquiring the elf, but that reason had now lost all meaning, and therefore his interest in the latest lot had disappeared. Siren frowned in confusion, unable to understand why this strange man had changed his mind so suddenly and radically, as if what had recently seemed important now didn't bother him at all. Suddenly, a loud, sharp sound cut through the silence, causing the girl to instantly tense up. Turning towards the source of the noise, she quickly turned ready to meet a new threat, or surprise at any moment. The two of them hurried to find the source of the strange noise, their steps sounding harmonious and fast, and the sound of boots echoed in the empty hall, gradually dying away somewhere ahead, as if someone was trying to hide from their pursuit. Siren, seemingly oblivious to everything around her, suddenly took off and began to run, her cloak fluttering in the air, like wings emphasizing the swiftness of her movements as her steps turned into an almost silent run. It didn't take long for the girl to stop in front of a stranger with bright blue hair who was standing next to an elf who was lying lifelessly on the floor, the unconscious body filling the atmosphere with anxiety. The girl's face reflected despair. Her eyes widened in fear, and stretching out her hand forward, she seemed to want to protect him, but her body froze as if time itself decided to slow down at that moment. The masked stranger, squatting lazily, stretched towards her, his movements calm, almost provocative, as if he was enjoying what was happening. Siren, overcome with terror, could not move. While behind her, the Duke, in a panic, noticing the danger, rushed forward, ready at any cost to protect his beloved from the threat. However, despite her anxiety, Siren was a strong woman, and instantly assessing the situation, she confidently parried the blow, blocking it with her hand, demonstrating that she was ready to stand up for herself in any situation, not giving the enemy the slightest chance. With a slight grin, as if hiding her dislike for this strange stranger, she laughed it off by asking what he wanted from her at all, knowing full well that he clearly had magic that could be as dangerous as it was clumsy. The strange man, despite his evil disposition and cold behavior, could not help but attract attention with his appearance. Curly hair, regular facial features, and of course, eyes. Bright blue, full of some hidden tension and mysterious shine. Suddenly, a man's hand quickly grabbed Siren by the wrist, covering the bracelet, and the Duke's voice, cold and commanding, uttered a request not to interfere, as if it was more important than everything that was happening at that moment. Holding her close to him tenderly but firmly, the Duke tried to protect the noblewoman, standing before her like a kind of shield ready to withstand any blows of fate, if only she remained safe. The man, without taking his eyes off what was happening, gently asked her to be patient for a little while, even if it was unpleasant, because at that moment he was hiding her face, protecting her from prying eyes, so that she would not be noticed and would not be caused additional harm, no matter how hard it was for him. When Siren, unable to bear it, bit his finger, The Duke did not even flinch, did not show the slightest sign of pain or irritation, continuing to stand as if this gesture had no meaning for him, and everything was as usual. The masked man smiled and asked the Duke if they had met before, as his face seemed familiar to him, as if they had crossed paths in the past. But the Duke just coldly ignored the question. Aegis rudely replied that it did not matter, and if the stranger really intended to kill the elf, then it would be better to do it quickly, without wasting time on empty talk, which caused indignation in the lady whom he still held in his arms. Siren, clenching her hand into a fist in rage, was angry that her strange assistant not only did not help, but also acted somehow strangely, only worsening her situation, making her feel helpless. Finally, with incredible determination, the noblewoman tore herself away from the Duke's arms. Her anger and desire to protect the elf becoming stronger than her fear, she ran towards the lifeless body, deciding that she had to intervene somehow to save him. Ekult continued to lie motionless, and to check his condition, Siren anxiously reached forward, carefully directing her hand towards his nose, hoping to feel even the slightest breath that might mean that he was alive. With great relief, feeling the warm flow of air that touched her fingers, she exhaled with joy and pressed him to herself, because now she could be sure that her friend, about whom she was so worried, was not dead. The masked man looked up in surprise and alarm as he heard a loud crack as the ceiling began to collapse, and with each falling stone, it became clear that everything around him was turning into a death trap. After this, the stranger with a slight smile on his face apologized to them and said that he would be the first to leave this place, since he had the intention of surviving, and staying here would mean only one thing: inevitable death. Siren didn't want to let go of this mysterious man in a strange mask so easily, but looking around at the destruction, she realized that she had no other choice. The threat was too great, and she needed to move quickly to survive. With every stone that fell on their heads, with every roar that shook the walls, they realized that it was time to leave this place behind. Otherwise, it was too dangerous to take risks, and salvation required immediate action. The noblewoman quickly turned to her companion and asked excitedly if he could teleport 3 of them at once without risking their safety, since the situation was becoming increasingly critical, and time was at a premium. Without a word, the Duke embraced the noblewoman, and instantly they disappeared in a whirlwind of magic, leaving behind only a trail of glowing light, until their bodies disappeared into space, transported to their new destination. When they found themselves in the same ruined building, the semi-darkness and old walls greeted them again, creating an atmosphere of abandonment and despair, as a reminder of the destruction that remained after the disaster. Aegis awkwardly looked away when the sweet siren finally revealed his identity. The girl had long guessed who he really was, because his magic and manners were obvious to her, but she preferred not to ask unnecessary questions. After all, the Duke was the only one who possessed such a powerful force, and at the same time would agree to help his lady in any situation without asking questions or doubting her desires, ready to support her in the most difficult moments. Smiling Siren explained that it wasn't just his exceptional talent for witchcraft that gave her companion away, but also how quickly he protected her without thinking about his own well-being, and how he moved with amazing agility and strength. The Duke continued to stand silently, showing no sign of agitation, even as his beloved approached him, and beads of sweat ran down his forehead and cheek, creating a feeling of tension in the air. In a matter of seconds, the dark veil was thrown off his face and lay on the floor, leaving his face uncovered. And now everything around was illuminated by his presence, as if he himself was not just a man, but some kind of mysterious creature. As always, Aegis was beautiful. His purple eyes sparkled in the dim light. His dark hair fell over his shoulders, and his features, so clear and expressive, seemed created to be an object of admiration. Lifting the man's chin, Siren demanded to know what he was doing at the auction, her voice firm and confident, as she could no longer afford to ignore his mysterious presence in this dangerous place. After this, the lady sat down on the windowsill, crossing her legs, and asked with a slight challenge if he had enjoyed fooling her. There was mockery in her voice, but at the same time, there was a hidden resentment that she did not try to hide. The man replied that he was not the only one who had lied, but that the girl herself had also hidden the truth by changing her appearance and not telling him everything that had really happened, although he knew perfectly well that she had not been completely frank. When she asked why she bought the elf, Siren easily answered that she simply wanted it. but there was some uncertainty in her voice, as if she herself did not fully understand why she did it. Aegis, however, did not believe her words, and approaching her face firmly pointed out the lie that had come from her lips, for he knew that she was hiding something important that was perhaps connected with her real intentions. Suddenly, a man's hand grabbed her woman's, and the Duke, without looking away, asked what kind of golden bracelet was on her hand, as if trying to fish out another truth hidden in her answers. The lady swallowed, feeling her heart clench, with the realization that Aegis had finally taken the lead in their conversation. And now he was ready to get to the heart of the matter, leaving no doubt that his determination would not yield to any obstacle. Siren, gritting her teeth in pain, barely managed to say that she was in pain, and trying to hide her vulnerability, ordered the guy to immediately let go of her hand, although deep inside her soul, an internal struggle was overflowing, and she could not help but feel how her strength was crumbling under his influence. But Aegis was stubborn with a predatory look, and without looking away, he asked his question again, demanding an explanation of why his lady needed this decoration, something more hidden behind this mysterious golden bracelet. The girl, without blinking, looked him straight in the eyes and firmly declared that if he did not immediately let her go, he would never see her again in this life, as if challenging his authority and power. The man's fingers immediately let go. Noticing the sly expression on his face, Siren asked her interlocutor with a smile if he was now jealous of her enjoying the moment of victory and the same feeling of power that she felt. Aegis, smiling sadly, admitted that, of course, he was jealous, because his love for his companion was so strong that every hidden word or action of hers disturbed his heart, and this feeling did not allow him to remain calm when she hid something from him. Siren, noticing his anxiety, changed the subject of the conversation, and looking into his eyes, repeated that she needed this elf, although she was not going to reveal the reasons for her choice, leaving everything in deep secret, hidden from prying eyes. To calm her lover, the beauty gently and warmly placed her hands on his face, lovingly touching his skin, and in this gesture she gave him her care and attention, hoping that this would ease his anxiety a little. Siren, looking into his eyes calmly and confidently, said that in reality, she just wanted to free him from someone else's influence and save him from manipulation that could change his mind and control over his actions. The Duke, still not understanding what exactly she meant, asked in bewilderment what exactly she meant by the words, "free him from someone else's influence," trying to understand what influence she was talking about and who could influence him. Suddenly, the nobleman's face distorted and tears glistened in his eyes, as if melancholy and sadness had seized his soul, and an invisible pain sounded in his voice when he asked in bewilderment whether the lady really intended to leave him. The truth was that if you open the door to a bird that has been locked in a cage for a long time, it, despite its freedom, will not dare to fly away, but will remain inside as if tied to the place that has become its safe and familiar home. And at that moment, Aegis was no different from that same bird who became afraid to leave his master despite his freedom, because the prison that had become his home seemed like a place where he felt protected and needed. The girl, without taking her eyes off the cage, wondered whether she should forcibly free her pet so that he could finally feel freedom, because perhaps for him, this would be an important step on the path to true happiness. The man pressed himself against his mistress's hand softly, saying that he would gladly stay with her forever, because for him there was no greater happiness than to be near her, feeling her presence in his life as something special and valuable. Suddenly, the lady interrupted him, asking with a slight doubt in her voice if he was not afraid of freedom, and that his feelings for her would disappear as soon as the spell that held him near fell off, and he saw the world in a different light, freed from the magic that so strongly influenced his perception. The lady clenched her fist, remembering what happened when she gave the handsome man the antidote, and he, instead of gratitude, became angry, barely containing his rage, not realizing that his feelings could be deceiving. Aegis firmly stated that even if she removed his shackles and restored his sanity, he would not change, continuing to love her with the same strength as before, because his feelings were sincere despite the magic that bound them. The girl stopped, lost in thought, and was internally worried not only for herself, but also for the Duke, because she was already disgusted that despite his love, she could not reciprocate his feelings, experiencing only anxiety and doubts. The young couple's hands gently joined, and at that moment, Aegis finally gave his consent to try to free his mind from the alien influence, deciding to take the risk in order to return to his true essence and understand what was happening in his soul. The strong man asked the lady not to be offended by him when, after the spell was lifted, he would stop loving her for a while because he knew that his feelings would change, but he promised that later, having realized everything, he would deeply regret his loss. The girl sat on a chair while her hair was combed and new clothes were selected, for her feeling how this preparation for change and the remaking of her appearance became a symbol of her inner state, her readiness to accept what awaited her. After their adventure, they teleported back to the lady's estate, and then the Countess, with a firm look, and in her usual style, gave her the order to keep a close eye on her dog. That is the Duke, reminding her of her responsibility for his future. The maid bowed respectfully to her mistress, before leaving her movements full of respect, as if every detail of her behavior spoke of unconditional devotion and readiness to serve at any moment. The beautiful siren was finally able to fall onto the bed with relief, feeling her tension melt away and allowing herself to relax, forgetting about the worries and anxieties that had tormented her heart for so long. Soon night fell, and it became dark outside, and the light curtains fluttering in the wind gave the room an atmosphere of privacy, as if the whole world had frozen in anticipation of something important and inevitable. Getting out of bed, the girl realized with surprise that she had been in a deep sleep all this time, and she thought with excitement that she absolutely needed to see the Duke as soon as possible in order to understand what was happening and what his feelings were. However, as soon as she rose to her feet, a voice was heard from behind the door, cautiously asking if she could come in, and this unexpected address made her feel a little tense because she had not expected a visit at such a late hour. The girl carefully closed the door, peering into the darkness with interest, and raising her gaze saw her night guest who was standing behind the threshold, and she became curious about who could come to disturb her loneliness at this moment. It was Aegis who, bottle in hand, and in his pajamas entered his beloved's chambers, seemingly oblivious to the circumstances, and his presence brought a slight tension and surprise into the atmosphere. Holding the drink forward, the man asked with a smile if she would be willing to share a drink with him, and there was a slight playfulness in his voice, as if he wanted to add a casualness to this moment of their communications. The consent was given, and the glasses of wine were carefully placed on the table, filling with the cherry-hued red wine, which, as if in anticipation, poured into the bowls, creating an atmosphere of lightness and relaxation. The red wine, with its spicy aroma, slowly poured into the containers, and its scent filled the room, giving it an atmosphere of warmth and comfort, as if it were a moment when time stopped for a moment. Siren took the glass, enjoying every sip of the drink, allowing herself to forget about her problems and just enjoy the moment, which seemed relaxed and full of lightness as a symbol of a break with heavy thoughts. The mansion was filled with luxurious furniture. Every corner exuded refined elegance, the windows were exquisitely decorated, and a deep silence reigned in the room, as if the air itself held its breath, waiting for some important event that could disturb the silence and peace. Suddenly, Aegis, who had been silent until then, suggested that his beloved play some kind of game, filling the space not only with words, but also with a light excitement, as if inviting her to a new test, to find out which of them would be stronger. The aristocrat then smiled mysteriously and added that whoever won would have the right to command his opponent for the next hour, making him fulfill any desires, which added even more tension and intrigue to the game. The beauty, intrigued by such a proposal, could not resist and agreed, offering to play chess, because in her eyes the excitement of the game was always not only a challenge, but also an opportunity to demonstrate her mental abilities. The chess pieces were neatly placed on the board. The game was started, and its course predictably turned into a tense confrontation where every move could be decisive, and victory seemed not so far away. The girl had never lost to her boyfriend before, and now, shocked that she had lost this time, she could not hide her shock at the unexpected turn of events, realizing that this moment had changed the course of the game and her confidence. Aegis, sitting opposite, looked pleased and happy, enjoying his victory in this bet, his face shining with confidence, as if he had long known that this moment would be his triumph. Realizing that she had lost, the lady accidentally touched the chessboard with her hand, and as if justifying her defeat, said that she had done it by accident, dropping all the pieces on the floor, which further fueled the atmosphere of slight tension in the room. The Duke merely smiled readily, agreeing to start the game over again, his confidence obvious. He had no doubt that this time the result would be the same as last time, in his favor. However, the lady lost again, and her white pieces were mercilessly crushed by the black ones played by her opponent, leaving her with a feeling of dissatisfaction and failure, since she could not even win the game. Resigned to defeat Siren, feeling bitter at her own weakness, asked Ages what exactly he wanted her to do in the next hour, her voice carrying a hint of resignation, but still retaining a subtle spark of curiosity. Ages, seated on a chair, thought for a moment, and then, with a slight smile, suggested that the lady first stand up, and then slowly and confidently come closer to him, creating an atmosphere of anticipation and excitement before his next words. Almost silently, the beauty approached him, and sensing the tension in the air, the man with a slight smile invited her to sit down next to him, which looked like an invitation to a world where there was no place for doubts or excuses. The noblewoman succumbing to temptation, and the Duke's words sat on his lap as he had said, and her heart beat faster, for it was a familiar gesture of intimacy that seemed new and unforgettable to both. The man who approached her leaned down to bite her neck, and his movements were full of passion, as if he could not contain what was bursting out, subjugating her with his presence and temptation. The aristocrat winced at the unpleasant feeling, and with a slight worry in her voice, asked him not to leave traces, as she did not want to wear dresses with high collars again, which she did not like because of their discomfort. To make things fair, the man with a slight smile offered to play chess again if his mistress so desired, as if returning them to a more familiar environment, where they could prove themselves in a struggle, not only with their minds, but also with their wills. Suddenly, without any warning, Siren hit her interlocutor's forehead, with her fingers changing the subject and declaring that she no longer wished to play with him, but would try to play with another man, leaving him with confusion and slight surprise. His brow furrowed in jealousy, asked who exactly? She meant what other man she was going to test herself on. His voice, full of possessiveness, echoing around the room. Holding the lady in his arms, the aristocrat, with a slight sadness in his voice, asked her not to joke like that anymore, because he did not want to think that she could love someone else, and thoughts about this oppressed his soul. The lady, with a slight movement, reached for the glass of wine, wanting to take a few more sips to refresh herself, and perhaps forget herself for a while, drowning in this drink the heavy thoughts that had become more acute after the words of her companion, which had left a mark on her soul. Feeling his neck under her fingers, Siren realized that she actually wanted to take revenge on him, to leave her marks on his skin, leaving bites, so that he would never forget this moment in which she simultaneously felt power, passion, and an inexpressible desire to control him. Ages, who had not expected such a turn of events, flinched from the suddenness. When the lady bit him, and unable to contain his emotions, he screamed, embarrassed, and feeling himself in such an awkward position that he did not immediately know how to react to this unexpected gesture. Covering his face with his hand, the Duke tried to look away. His face flushed, and shyness made him turn away, at the same time feeling how shame intertwined with the unexpected excitement that the lady's actions caused, leaving him in a state of confusion. However, despite the fact that time was inexorably passing and the hour flew by quickly, the clock continued to tick, as if emphasizing how elusively moments disappear and how precious every moment with her is. Leaning her head wearily onto the nobleman's shoulder, the noblewoman muttered under her breath that it was time to sleep her words, carrying a slight note of weariness, but also a deep sense of peace. Carefully and tenderly, the nobleman lifted his beloved into his arms and carried her to the bed. His care and attention to her were obvious as he tried to make her rest as comfortable as possible. After that, the handsome man lay down next to her, carefully throwing the blanket over her so that they could both settle in comfortably and fall asleep, their bodies merging into one, creating a feeling of serene warmth and complete protection, as if the world around them had ceased to exist. The balcony doors were open, revealing a beautiful night sky full of bright stars, their light flickering in the darkness, creating a magical atmosphere of peace and quiet, perfect for sleep. The hand moved the pen smoothly across the paper, leaving elegant, clear strokes on it, as if each word was carefully thought out and dictated by care and attention to detail. In this letter, Siren explained that she intended to stay with the Duke's family for a while, clarifying that her presence would be temporary, but she hoped that this decision would bring harmony to her life. In response, Michael, with his usual seriousness, told her to be careful in the family, warning her of the possible dangers and difficulties that could await her in this new environment. Such letters were usually quickly reread, and without regret sent into the flames of the fire, dissolving in the fire, as if their contents had never existed, leaving only a mysterious emptiness that nothing could fill. 4 days passed unnoticed, and then finally, a servant's voice was heard from behind the door, who announced that the lady had received a new letter, which immediately attracted her attention and made her heart beat a little faster from curiosity and anticipation. Siren wasted no time in nodding to the servant, allowing him to enter, and holding back a slight nervousness, she resolutely reached out her hand to take the message, not knowing what exactly it would bring at that moment, making her heart beat faster. This time, the envelope bore the official seal of the palace itself, which made Siren's heart beat a little faster with excitement, because the famous seal of a wealthy family always promised special attention and serious events. However, once she opened the letter, her hopes were dashed, as it only contained an invitation to a banquet from the imperial family. Nothing significant or unusual, and Siren's heart was left with only a slight hint of disappointment. Siren frowned as she realized that this letter was a harbinger of the momentous events that she could not have foreseen, and that these events would possibly change her life, no matter how hard she tried to avoid their influence. The wounded man, covered in wounds, begged for salvation, his voice trembling with pain and fear. He asked to be spared, not realizing that his fate had already been decided, and that his prayers could not change the decision that had been made in advance. The guy who stood nearby, trying to help and hoping for forgiveness, frantically thought about who among his acquaintances could hold a grudge against him, and who was capable of organizing such a cruel revenge, unable to understand what caused this tragedy. And so, when the silence was broken by the Duke's voice sounding cold and confident, he declared that it was he who had sent mercenaries to the old enemy to avenge long-forgotten grievances, not hiding his determination to carry out his revenge. With tears in his eyes, the wounded man again began to beg for mercy. His voice was full of fear and despair, but his words did not touch the hearts of those standing around, and with each word he felt how hope was leaving, and his fate was becoming more and more sad. Without listening to him any further, Aegis, with an indifferent expression on his face, declared that this man no longer had any meaning to him. His fate no longer concerned him, and he did not even wish to listen to his desperate requests. Leaving this guy alive was extremely dangerous, because now that the protagonist of the novel learned about the black market, he could find out that the Duke was somehow connected to it, which would threaten not only his reputation, but also the safety of the entire family. Moreover, the aristocrat was deeply angered by the fact that all these events at the auction had put his dear beloved in danger, and he could not forgive himself for allowing such incidents to happen in her life, despite all the precautions. The Duke made a majestic gesture, and this gesture became the fatal symbol of the end of life for the man standing on the ground. A man's life, like a fleeting fire, went out in an instant, vanishing as if it had never existed. Blood flowing from the wound covered the nobleman's boots, leaving stains on them that, like an indelible memory, will forever remain a reminder of what happened, of how a tragic death overshadowed the majestic course of events that turned everything upside down. Aegis frowned and muttered quietly that if his scent turned out to be unpleasant, then Siren would certainly be displeased, because he did not want to disappoint her, not wanting to make her feel irritated or upset. At that moment, the girl, putting her hand to her face, tried to concentrate to remember what happened in the original version of the novel, trying to restore the chronology of events that seemed so familiar and important to her. On the day of the grand banquet, which was to be the culmination of the evening, the expected event was to occur: an attack on the Holy Virgin, which would cause a wave of shock and alarm everyone present at the celebration. The perpetrators of this attack will be mysterious cloaked men belonging to a dangerous group whose faces are hidden, leaving only vague shadows that threaten everything they touch and create an atmosphere of fear. Everyone believed that if they sacrificed the Holy Virgin, God would return to earth, and this would be an act of great purification, after which the world would be filled with light again, and their faith would be justified. People who joined this sect became black sorcerers, turning to dark forces and magic, with each of their actions strengthening their powers, but also plunging deeper into the abyss of unknown and dangerous secrets. After the war, the Empire began to actively persecute all who used dark magic, punishing them with cruel punishments, sparing no one who was seen using the dark arts, and tried to hide from its merciless wrath. People who possessed the dark power had no choice but to join dangerous organizations and hide, because otherwise the Empire would inevitably give them death without giving them a chance for salvation or redemption. However, in the book, the Black Magician's plan to kill the Holy Virgin failed because she was saved in time by the protagonist, who by showing willpower and determination was able to prevent the tragedy and change the course of fate. The man who saved the poor beauty then experienced a moment when love flared up between them, which became a real cliché, like in old novels, where rescue always led to mutual feelings and fateful events. The Black Magicians did not cease their actions, but after some time, they became silent and disappeared, leaving the book with uncertainty about the reasons for their disappearance, as if the hidden threat itself had dissolved into the shadows. And the saddest thing about this story was that the villains who were behind everything that was happening were Aegis and Siren herself, the heroes who were supposed to be on the side of good, but turned out to be the culprits of this whole tragedy. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, and the maid entered, asking with slight excitement whether they could perhaps enter the mistress's chambers without disturbing her privacy and giving her the necessary space for reflection. Brushing a strand of white hair away from her face, the noblewoman nodded softly. Giving her permission to enter her gaze was determined, but there was a certain benevolence in it, as if she was making an important decision. The girl jumped up with delight, learning that their guest had finally woken up after a long sleep. Her face filled with joy, as if the long-awaited moment that everyone had been hoping for had finally arrived. Siren reached out to open the door to the room where the patient lay, her fingers trembling slightly with excitement, as if each of her gestures was not just an action, but part of something more important, an invisible process that she could not control. Ickelt sat on the bed, his head down, trying to recover from the shock he had experienced. His movements were slow and hesitant, as if each gesture was given to him with great difficulty, and he was having difficulty regaining control over his body and mind. The bandaged man was gradually recovering. His tortured body, still covered with painful wounds, had not yet fully recovered from the ordeal. But with each day, with each moment, he was getting closer to his healing. Siren was relieved to see that the transformation magic had remained true to her so far, and seeing that everything had gone according to plan, she wondered if she should show her true nature, since the world was not yet ready for this revelation. Coming closer, the lady inquired about the comfort of their guest. Her voice was soft and caring, as if she was genuinely concerned about his well-being, trying to do everything possible to ease his suffering. The elf frowned, his face twisted in pain, as he reminded him that Siren had promised to save him earlier, but in the end had almost killed him. The words sounded heavy, as if each memory was a deep wound for him, opening up old, not yet healed experiences. Looking down at the floor, the beauty sincerely apologized for hurting him. Her face darkened with shame, and her voice sounded genuinely hurt, as if she felt the full weight of her actions. The handsome man firmly declared that he believed the woman's words, and hoping for their sincerity, waited for her for a long time, but she still did not come. And with each moment, his wait became more and more difficult and painful. The man's hand gripped the fabric of the bed tightly, his fingers digging into it, as if trying to hold on to his last strength. He felt how he had trusted her words in vain, and now that hope was beginning to fade, his heart was filled with bitterness and disappointment. The boy had lost hope in life more than once, and every time when it seemed that all was lost, he found the strength to fight again. However, now his thoughts were in confusion. He did not know which path to choose, and what to trust. His soul was engulfed in chaos and uncertainty. Sitting on the bed, his back to the lady of the house, he quietly muttered that he wanted to live so much. His voice sounded like a whisper of despair, and every breath he took felt like a struggle for survival, while his soul searched for even the smallest spark of hope. Suddenly, the elf turned to the lady and smiled, thanking her for saving him. His face lit up with gratitude, and in his eyes, one could see not only appreciation, but also a faint spark of hope for a better future. The fireplace in the room was burning its flames softly, illuminating the space, filling it with warmth and comfort. And at that moment, among all this light, there was silence broken only by the crackling of the wood. The noblewoman stopped in shock, not expecting the man to forgive her so easily. The hem of her dress slid along the floor, leaving traces behind symbolizing her bewilderment and surprise at his unexpected forgiveness. A slight blush appeared on the aristocrat's cheeks, and her feminine gaze became soft and warm. Suddenly, she felt how all the tension slowly left, and her eyes filled with light, as if the inner warmth melted all the shyness, giving her face incredible tenderness. Suddenly, the elf became angry. The man's face distorted with anger, and hissing, he asked the beauty why he looked like a man. His words sounded like a reproach, and his whole appearance was filled with irritation and discontent. Siren stood on the balcony, enjoying the view of the tree growing right next to the railing, and her gaze was directed into the distance, and she walked in her thoughts, allowing herself a few minutes of peace and solitude, enjoying the silence of the surrounding world. The maid, who was busy preparing the table for tea, politely informed the lady that their guest would soon arrive, and asked her to be ready to meet them, as the drawing room preparations were almost complete. Siren lowered her head and thought that her friend probably had a lot of important things to do, because he was late, and this made her feel a little anxious, as if something in his life might delay him. Eaglet, having learned that she had changed her appearance with the help of magic several times, became very angry. His face became gloomy, and a fire of anger played in his eyes, because this betrayal violated all their previous agreements. The elf didn't like the changes that had happened to him. His veins bulged on his neck, and his gaze became gloomy and tense, as if he was trying to understand what exactly had happened and how it was affecting his inner world. The moment when the maid's crystal-like voice pierced the silence, interrupting her thoughts, and she announced that the Duke had finally returned, made the lady's heart beat faster, filled with excitement and anticipation of the meeting that was about to take place. Cart stopped near the mansion, his steps becoming cautious and measured, as if he was aware of the importance of the moment, and was preparing to meet something important that was to happen that evening. The maid hastened to carry out her mistress's order, heading upstairs to call the Duke to the balcony. The lady was full of determination and had no doubt that her actions exactly corresponded to the order, confident in her role and the importance of this step. Awkwardly, with a slight expression of confusion on her face, the beautiful Siren rubbed her elbow with one hand, realizing that the house in which she grew up, and which was her childhood friend, was now her own, and everything around was subject to her will. The reason for such an obedient and unconditional attitude of the servants towards Siren was simple. They were all strictly ordered to obey Ages, who commanded them to carry out any order of his beloved, no matter how strange or unusual it was. Siren yawned from fatigue and lack of sleep, covering her mouth with her hand, trying to hide the signs of her sleepless night. She still felt the weight of lack of sleep, as if her every movement was burdened with fatigue, and her eyes betrayed her long hours of sleepless wakefulness. Suddenly, Siren remembered that she needed to go to the store to choose a new suit for the Duke, and wondered which one would be better, dark or light, which would emphasize his noble status and style. There was a slight noise, and Ages entered the room, confident, reserved, and absolutely impassive. His face betrayed nothing, but merely reflected the calm determination that was inherent in him in any circumstances, regardless of what was happening around him. The water, like raindrops, flowed down the young man's body, as if he had just stepped out of a pool, and the drops ran down his neck, creating the illusion that he had not had time to dry off at all since his hasty arrival. Answering his mistress's question, Ages said with a slight smile that he was in a hurry to get to her as quickly as possible, and therefore did not have time to dry off. Although despite his wet hair, his calmness and confidence remained unshakable. He had a towel in his hands, which he clutched, trying to somehow cover up his carelessness in clothing, but his appearance still remained impeccable, even in such a slightly careless form. The Duke, feeling his face flush deeply with embarrassment, instantly consented to his lady's request, and gratefully allowed her to help him wipe the drops of water from his face and hair, without hiding his embarrassment. Sitting down in front of the noblewoman Ages, settled himself with maximum comfort, feeling that at that moment her care and attention meant more to him than anything in the world, and he was ready to do everything not to disappoint her and fulfill any of her wishes. The maiden, carefully wiping the wet strands of his hair with a towel, asked how the nobleman's day had gone, taking an interest in his affairs and what he had been doing, because every moment spent next to him brought her pleasure and interest. Ages lied when he said he hadn't done anything special, but there was a note of tension in his voice, and although Siren didn't believe his words, she chose to remain silent, feeling that it was not a good time to insist. Not wanting the boy to get sick from the cold drops, Siren headed to the wardrobe, deciding to find dry clothes for him, because caring for his health was the most important thing to her, and the cold could only make the situation worse. Aegis, slightly surprised, looked up when a new shirt suddenly flew towards him, as if thrown by an invisible hand. He did not immediately understand how to react to such an unexpected and unusual manifestation of concern from the lady, which made him a little confused. The nobleman, standing in the process of changing clothes, was absorbed in the process, when suddenly Siren announced that the elf they saved had finally come to his senses, and her words suddenly caught his attention, switching his thoughts to a new event. Siren firmly stated that once Ekult was fully healed, she would prepare a special potion that Aegis would definitely drink in order to regain his sanity and get rid of the foggy state that still hid his true nature. Time was slipping away, and the clock, with its inexorable and continuous ticking, seemed to remind us of the fleetingness of each moment, not allowing us to get stuck in thoughts and taking our thoughts further and further away from the current moment. Aegis, however, remained where he was, showing no inclination to agree with his mistress's assertions. He remained silent, absorbed in his own thoughts, and did not hurry to answer, as if he were stalling for time, trying to figure out what to do next. The hallucinations that had entangled the young man's mind like a sinister poison clouded his thoughts, and the acrid smell that filled the space left a noticeable mark on his perception, causing more and more harm and destroying his ability to think clearly. Suddenly, Aegis stood up from his seat, feeling his body making a decision as if on autopilot, and despite the internal struggle, he rose to his feet, leaving all doubts behind and taking a step towards the inevitable. After this, the Duke, overcoming his confusion, stepped towards his beloved and, uniting their hearts, tightly embraced her by the shoulders, as if trying to protect her from all the adversities and threats that might arise on their way. The handsome man's gaze was clouded as if by a dark storm, the threat of which hung over everything, making the heart tremble, and it seemed that there was only one thing left to do: to quickly run away to avoid the imminent danger emanating from this gaze. The lady winced in pain as she was suddenly dropped onto the bed, and despite her efforts to remain calm, she could not hide her displeasure at such cruel treatment. Feeling anxiety filling her soul, the noblewoman, overcome with anxiety, asked her companion to stop and finally come to his senses. But her words could not reach his mind because Aegis, in his mad impulse, did not want to listen, absorbed in his own desires. But despite her words, Aegis did not listen, but with love and tenderness ran his hand over the cheek of his beloved, stroking her hair as if trying to calm her down, despite the fact that his actions were filled with conflicting feelings. Loudly and clearly, with complete confidence in her words, Siren declared that if the young man really wanted to kill her, then he should remember that she was the only one who could save him, bring him back to his senses, and free him from all the mental anguish that tormented him. After these words, the girl, without thinking, used her powerful red magic, creating a powerful wave of power that pushed the Duke away from her, sending him far away, as if trying to get rid of him, not giving him the opportunity to get closer. Aegis, unable to withstand the force of the magical blow, fell to the floor, losing consciousness, and as if in oblivion, found himself right at the feet of his mistress, immersed in a deep sleep, unable to even get up, leaving all his thoughts and feelings behind. A shudder of fear passed through the lady's body, and her thoughts instantly returned to what she had experienced 2 years ago, when she again wondered whether her companion would remember everything that had happened this time, or like then, would again fall into oblivion. Frozen awkwardly on the carpet, the girl felt her nerves giving out, and the thoughts that tormented her, filled with doubts and fears, mercilessly tormented her, forcing her to feel pain and despair from what she could not change. But gathering all her determination, Siren finally pulled herself together and made a firm decision not to give up, intending to save the Duke, despite all the difficulties and dangers that could be encountered on her way in this difficult and thorny matter. Entering the other guests' chambers, the two reluctantly, but still decisively, asked him to have a serious conversation, realizing that only through a frank conversation could she understand what to do next and how to act in the current situation. Ekult received her into his chambers, listening attentively to her request, and then added slightly awkwardly that the lady looked rather tired, pale and unwell, which made him even more worried about her condition. The lantern stood on the nightstand, softly illuminating the room with its dim light, and nearby on the table, candles were also burning, creating an atmosphere of coziness and peace despite all the tension in the air. Siren, deciding that she could not put it off any longer, came to him to remind him of his old promise to prepare the medicine as soon as possible, because the situation was getting worse every day and there was no time to delay. The man, having listened to her request and agreed to help, could not help but notice the strange expression on her face, which changed to guilty. With suspicion in his voice, he asked her what made her look like that, because he felt that something was hidden behind her words. Folding his arms across his chest, the elf reminded her with a slight grin that in exchange for her help, the beauty was obliged to let him go free. And although his words were calm, there was a hidden threat in them that made one wonder about his true intentions. The estate they were in was majestic, huge, with beautiful architecture that made one admire its details and scale. Every corner of this house seemed to hide its own history and secrets that could only be revealed to those who were ready to understand them. And it was the owner of this impressive estate, the man who needed to be saved, who turned out to be Ages, a young duke whose life now depended on whether they could cope with the magic that had captured his mind and heart. The boy was exposed to dark magic, which was enhanced by the aromas of incense and other herbs, which not only poisoned his mind, but also distorted his perception of the world. And the candles burning in the room created an atmosphere in which the magic became stronger. The elf, upon hearing what exactly had caused the duke's illness, opened his eyes in shock, realizing the seriousness of the situation, and his face instantly changed expression as he realized that the consequences of such magic could be catastrophic. The man, upon hearing that the aristocrat had been exposed to powerful herbs for as long as 6 years, screamed loudly in horror, realizing the harm it had done to his mind, as such herbs could destroy a person's personality and leave a permanent mark on a person's mind. Siren quietly confirmed his words, adding that Ages was not only tortured for a long time, and often, but also constantly breathed in poisonous herbs, which was completely incredible because no one survived such exposure, and her heart sank from this terrible truth. Eekelt, unable to hide his shock, covered his face with his hand, clearly frightened and stunned. Although Siren had not yet finished her story about how deep the nobleman's illness was, and how its effects were destroying his soul and body, Eekelt sat down tiredly in a chair in the living room of the estate, closing his eyes, trying to comprehend what he had heard, because now he knew that the Duke had not only been poisoned in the mind, but also his brainwashed with hallucinogens, which made the situation even more hopeless and tragic. Siren fell silent, unsure how to begin to tell the truth about her family, who had abused the Duke and broken his will since he was a child. The words she had to say seemed so heavy that her heart sank in fear of the revelation. Finally, standing by the window, the girl decided to start her story from the very beginning, realizing that only in this way could she free herself from the burden of silence, and perhaps find the path to redemption and understanding that she had been searching for all her life. Sitting next to the guy on the bed, time passed inexorably, and finally, she finished her story, revealing the whole truth that she had hidden from everyone for so long. Every word was filled with pain, and a heavy silence filled the room as she spoke her last words. With her face buried in the blanket, as if trying to hide from herself, the sweet Siren added with alarm that she did not know for sure whether she would be able to save the Duke, and was afraid that it was already too late to do anything because everything could be irretrievably lost. For a long time, Siren studied various books and treatises, trying to find ways to heal, but all the methods she found turned out to have side effects, which only added to her despair and made her doubt her ability to help the Duke. Eekelt, sitting next to her, noticed how upset his interlocutor was, and seeing how tears were blurring her eyes, he gently asked her not to cry, trying to support and comfort her in this difficult moment. Brushing a strand of hair from her face, he promised with determination that he would help her through this ordeal, assuring her that she would not be alone, that he would be there, and that together they would find a way to overcome any difficulties, no matter how difficult their path might be. At that moment, it seemed to the beauty that the elf was very similar to her older brother, in his care and attention. He was so sincere and strong in his desire to help that it caused an irresistible feeling of nostalgia and warmth in her. The man asked irritably why the lady had suddenly started laughing, and she, unable to contain herself, was shaking with laughter, not understanding how she had ended up in such an absurd situation. But her laughter was full of lightness and some inexplicable freedom. With a firm look, not hiding her concern, the beauty asked the man if he knew about a rare and special herb that was extremely difficult to obtain, and that its effect could be exactly what they needed in this situation. The elf confirmed that he knew about such a medicine, but added that its effect would be too weak, lasting only 5 or 10 minutes, which was not enough to solve all their problems. Siren suddenly realized why the Duke had lost consciousness so quickly last time, and was unable to carry out his threat, as this herb, although it had medicinal properties, was not enough to give him the strength he needed. Still sullen, Yahello continued that this rare herb, in addition to its weak effect, could also have side effects that were not the most pleasant, because its effect did not always bring the desired relief and sometimes caused much more problems. There have been cases where if the patient suffered from intolerance to this medicine, it not only did not bring relief, but on the contrary, it intensified the hallucinations, causing the person much more suffering than before its use. Tilting her head to the side, the noblewoman thoughtfully wondered if the side effects might not appear immediately, but after some time, because she felt that this herb still concealed many unknown dangers. Receiving a denial in response, the maiden sighed heavily, then stood up from her seat and, apologizing, admitted that she had interfered with the healing of their guest, since her concern should not have interfered with such an important process. The lady smiled, thanking the guy for listening to her, and not judging her for his tolerance and attention to her words, helped her feel understood in this difficult moment. Walking through the corridors of the mansion, Siren thoughtfully thought about the side effects that should not have manifested themselves, but for some reason unexpectedly affected the Duke after some time, and this mysterious turn of events did not give her peace. For some reason, the maiden stopped at her lover's room, standing in front of the doors, and for a moment her heart sank before she resolutely turned around and walked away, feeling the tension inside her become more and more unbearable. However, before she could fully move away, the doors suddenly opened, as if the owner of the room had heard the noblewoman approaching, and her gaze met his, causing her heart to skip a beat. The woman's hand clenched tightly into a fist, and the lady said to herself that she should not have looked back, because she knew that this could have led to even greater consequences than she could have imagined. But suddenly, the Duke's voice was heard asking where she was going and why she had not come to see him. His words, filled with surprise and slight reproach, made her freeze in place. He stopped her by the wrist, with his hand not allowing her to take a single step forward. And despite this, his touch was so powerful and decisive that Siren felt her heart flutter, but she could not allow herself to show weakness. Siren firmly asked the man to let her go, deciding that she would not indulge his persistence and would not disobey her own decisions if the guy dared to violate her personal boundaries again. The Duke, not immediately realizing what had happened, took the blame upon himself, asking with slight bewilderment whether he had done something wrong, because he could not understand what led to such a cold attitude on the part of the lady, especially since his feelings were sincere and full of regret. The aristocrat stood there disappointed and devastated, realizing that the man remembered nothing of their last meeting, which struck a painful blow to her heart and left her with a bitterness in her soul that their relationship had become something alien and unrecognizable. The beauty abruptly pulled her hand out of his grip, and with bitterness in her voice, firmly stated that it seemed she was ready to let him go, seeing no more point in staying by his side if everything they had was destroyed and lost its meaning. Ages confused, and with bitterness in his eyes, admitted that his mistress had been too cruel to him, and his soul was filled with a feeling of pain and regret because he did not know how to correct the situation that seemed hopeless and too difficult for him. The lady, without a single glance in his direction, walked away forcefully, closing the door behind her, leaving the Duke alone in silence, where his thoughts were intertwined with emotions, and he could not understand what had caused this break and how it could be repaired. The lady was awakened by the insistent voice of her maid, who, despite her desire to sleep a little longer, tried to wake her up, reminding her of the beginning of a new day and all the affairs that awaited her. Feeling slightly unwell and tired inside, Siren looked up weakly, ordering her maid to leave the room. The lady decided that she needed to rest a little to regain her strength and feel better again. When it was remarked that her face looked tear-stained, the aristocrat replied with slight irritation that this was absolutely not the case, and that her appearance was merely the result of a long sleep which had failed to fully restore her strength despite all her efforts. The maid, noticing the tension in the relationship between the master and mistress, as well as how they had become very distant from each other after their last quarrel, was in no hurry to leave, realizing that her presence might be appropriate at this moment. In the morning, in a somber mood, Aegis decided to personally conduct training for his knights, focusing on strict control and brutal discipline to test their limits and prepare them for any challenge. After the fencing lesson was over, the guards, barely able to stand on their feet, moved with difficulty, hardly realizing how hard and cruel this day had been, because the teacher did not spare them in his desire to temper their spirit and body. The servant's bell stood on the nightstand, motionless and silent, undisturbed by any sound, as if reflecting the atmosphere of silence that reigned in the room, where everyone seemed ready to remain silent and not disturb this moment of peace. Siren, despite the news brought by the servant, remained outwardly indifferent, as if nothing could disturb her, and without showing the slightest interest, ordered transport to be prepared, since she needed to go on important business to a distant place. In the carriage that was moving forward, Siren sat looking flawless, dressed in an elegant new white dress that perfectly highlighted her sophistication, and the silver jewelry on her hair sparkled, giving her image even more sophistication. After some time, when the horse finally slowed down, the carriage stopped, and the coachman, straightening up and bowing slightly, announced that they had arrived at their destination, where all the necessary affairs and events were already awaiting her. The aristocrat, like a delicate lily of the valley flower, gracefully descended to the ground, her movements light and graceful, while the servant, quickly following her, carefully shouted for the mistress to return as soon as possible, as urgent business awaited her. The place where the lady headed turned out to be fashionable and famous among the nobility, a luxurious boutique where high society persons could buy exquisite things and enjoy the atmosphere of refined chic and impeccable taste. Entering the establishment, the woman, noticing her friend, approached her with a smile, greeting her warmly and saying that she had not met her in this place for a long time, where, according to her time, seemed to slow down in anticipation of new meetings and impressions. Pressing her hand to her mouth, the lady began to talk about the upcoming banquet at the Emperor's palace, discussing the rumors circulating around the event, and admiring the decorations in the display case, which attracted attention with their exceptional beauty and sophistication. Siren, deciding to end the conversation as quickly as possible, turned to another lady who worked as a seamstress in this boutique, with a question about the whereabouts of Madame the owner, and also clarified whether any location had been booked for her to participate in the upcoming event. The answer she received was negative, and with a slight sigh of disappointment, Siren decided that there was no time to waste, and continued her thoughts without dwelling on further details of the matter. Madame, being an incredibly talented woman who created unique designer items, was widely known and in demand, and as a result, she already had all her free time booked for the entire month in advance, which made her services extremely scarce. When they were about to refuse her the service, the noblewoman, without wasting any time, handed over a gold card on which her family's coat of arms was engraved, and this instantly changed the attitude of the service personnel towards her. The seamstress instantly fell silent, noticing the map, and quickly turning her gaze to what was happening, exclaimed in a loud voice that she would immediately bring her mistress as soon as she was ready to find out what was happening in this place. This card was a symbol of the exclusive status of its owner, who was always treated with special respect, since such clients received privileges that allowed them to count on higher-class service and attention. The madam finally approached the noblewoman, greeted her with restraint, gently apologizing for the delay, and promising that she would do everything possible to satisfy her wishes as quickly and efficiently as possible, despite the current situation. Sitting down on a comfortable sofa, Siren frankly admitted to the woman that despite all her efforts, she did